Order, please. We'll now begin with the daily routine, beginning with presenting and reading of petitions. Presenting reports of committees. The Honourable Chair of the Law Amendments Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as Chair of the Committee on Law Amendments, I am directed to report that the committee has met and considered the following bills. Bill number 189, an act to amend Chapter 1, 1992, Supplement of the Revised Statutes 1989, the House of Assembly Act. Bill number 192, an act to amend Chapter 300 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Municipal Elections Act. Bill number 193, an act to protect the titles of massage therapists. Bill number 197, an act to amend Chapter 81 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Companies Act. Chapter 98 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Cooperative Associations Act. And Chapter 101 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Corporation Registration Act. Bill number 201, an act to amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act, and Chapter 39 of the Acts of 2008, the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter, respecting on-site sewage disposal equipment. Bill number 203, an act respecting the labour relations between Her Majesty in right of the Province of Nova Scotia Crown Attorneys Association. The committee recommends these bills to the favourable consideration of the House without amendments.
Order that these bills be referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Bills. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a report entitled Government Advertising for 2018-2019.
The report is tabled. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to make an introduction before reading my petition.
Permission granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask my colleagues to draw their attention to the East Gallery, where we're joined today by staff from Sheriff Services. And as I call your name, I'd ask that you rise and remain standing. With us today is Deputy Chief Lindsay Herndon, Andrew Lance, the Manager of Policy and Projects, Ryan Croft, Inspector with the Dartmouth Provincial Court, Deputy Sheriff Jean-Michel Lunda, and Deputy Sheriff Jeremy Swinimer. And I ask members of the House to provide them a warm welcome. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia's deputy sheriffs are dedicated to ensuring the safety and security of our courts, court staff, and members of the public, and whereas their service to Nova Scotians extends beyond the scope of their roles to include numerous community-driven projects like their recently launched, first in Canada, Pink Patch project in support of breast cancer research and awareness, and whereas this initiative, led by Deputy Sheriff Kevin Hurst, has our deputy sheriffs wearing pink sheriff crests throughout the month of October and undertaking efforts to raise monies to support this cause that is dear to so many of us. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge the tremendous generosity and commitment to community of the Nova Scotia Sheriff Services. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed?
Agreed.
It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to make an introduction first.
Permission granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to draw the attention of the House to the East Gallery, where we have Jennifer Crawford, their partner, their mother, with us today. Jennifer was a former student of mine at West Kings High School, and when I read my resolution, you'll hear of her accomplishment, and it's one which I am indeed, and our community is extremely proud of. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia boasts a multitude of culinary arts opportunities which combine and promote the areas of recreation, the arts and cultural expression, And whereas from a young age, Jennifer Crawford began cooking recipes from her favorite cookbook belonging to her mother, which has served as one of her biggest inspirations that has led her to compete on the national MasterChef Canada stage. And whereas Jennifer worked hard and persevered, showing us that from those small towns, we can accomplish big things. And winning season 10 of MasterChef Canada, all while demonstrating that it is okay and important to be ourselves and to be proud of who we are. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the House congratulate Jennifer Crawford for winning season 10 of MasterChef Canada and making Nova Scotia proud. Mr. Speaker, ask for waiver of notice.
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
I was overcome by all the emotion of the House.
You didn't ask for it yet.
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage has asked for waiver. There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the week of October 15th to 21st is Small Business Week here in Canada, a celebration of Canadian entrepreneurs and their contribution to Canada's economy. And whereas small businesses in Nova Scotia continue to grow our economy every day, employing workers, investing in communities, and serving as important social and financial cornerstones of our province. And whereas the province of Nova Scotia is supporting small businesses by celebrating their success, reducing red tape, and by helping them hire and innovate and save money. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the Legislature recognize and congratulate small business owners, small business employees, and their families and the communities they serve. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passes without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Thank you. Whereas October is Dyslexia Awareness Month, which aims to increase awareness of this hereditary lifelong condition, and whereas 15 to 20% of Canadians live with dyslexia, which makes it difficult to read, write, and spell, and whereas students and others in Nova Scotia who have dyslexia need support to be successful in school and in life, therefore be it resolved that all members of this legislature recognize October as Dyslexia Awareness Month and also recognize the importance of removing barriers to success for those who live with dyslexia. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. We'll now move on to introduction of bills. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 2004, the Health Protection Act.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 2004, the Health Protection Act.
Bill number 210, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 2004, the Health Protection Act.
Ordered that this bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce an act entitled An Act to Amend Schedule A of Chapter 1 of the Acts of 2018, the Education Act, and Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995 to 96, the Education CSAP Act, respecting school capital construction.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Schedule A of Chapter 1 of the Acts of 2018, the Education Act, and Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education CSAP Act, respecting school capital construction.
Bill number 211, entitled An Act to Amend Schedule A of Chapter 1 of the Acts of 2018, the Education Act, and Chapter 1 of the Acts of 1995-96, the Education CSAP Act, respecting school capital construction.
Ordered that this bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Enhance Privacy and Access to Information.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Enhance Privacy and Access to Information.
Bill number 212, entitled An Act to Enhance Privacy and Access to Information.
Ordered that this bill be read a second time on a future day. We'll now move on to notices of motion. Statements by members. The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 5 years ago today, Canadians from coast to coast were shocked and frightened as an act of terrorism unfolded at the House of Commons. During the assault on our national capital, Corporal Nathan Cirillo was killed while standing sentry at the National War Memorial. Warrant Officer Patrice Vincent was run down 2 days before the Parliament Hill shootings and died from his injuries. Today, Canadians pause to acknowledge the lives and sacrifice of Corporal Cirillo and Warrant Officer Vincent, to thank all members of the Canadian Forces. Mr. Speaker, today I also reflect on the strength and resiliency of our democracy in this great country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
I'd like to draw the members' attention to the gallery opposite, where we are joined today by Lily Kate Williams and her parents, Selena and Matt. Lily Kate is an amazing Highland dancer and all-around accomplished young lady from Dartmouth South, and her mom, Selena, is a proud daughter of Pictou County, so please join me in welcoming them to the House.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Lily Kate Williams, an accomplished Highland dancer, hockey player, and all-around awesome girl. At the age of just 10 years old, Lily has already earned over 250 medals and 27 trophies for her dancing. She is the current Nova Scotia champion for her age group and competes across Canada as a proud member of Team Nova Scotia. This year, she competed at the Canadian Championships in Moncton and placed 5th and 6th in her dances. She was so proud to be a member of Team Nova Scotia and represent her province at Canadians. Lily's goal for this year is to work hard with her dance teacher, Jennifer Worthen, and prepare for the next provincial selection meet. Despite her dancing success and athletic prowess, when she grows up, Lily plans to be a Supreme Court justice. With her obvious work ethic, I am certain she can achieve all of her dreams. Congratulations on your amazing performances, Lily Kate, and good luck in your future competitions.
The Honourable Member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Small Business Week, it is my pleasure to recognize Mark Wilkinson of Timberley. Mark is the proud owner of Go Towing, a locally owned and operated business servicing the Halifax area. The company has an impressive fleet of vehicles able to meet challenging towing and recovery needs in the area. While Mark's vehicles are usually providing roadside assistance, recovering damaged cars, or transporting specialized equipment, Mark put his shining new flatbed truck to a new and valued purpose for our community. At the recent food truck rally organized by my constituency office, Mark parked a flatbed truck so it could be used as a stage for the musicians entertaining at the event. The flatbed truck was the perfect stage for our venue and provided the opportunity to incorporate entertainment into the event. I ask the members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly to join me in thanking Mark for his contribution to the community, which helped to make this event so successful. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to commemorate Len Thomas of Lyons Brook. Len was recently awarded the Jack Pink United Way Volunteer Award by the President of the Pictou County United Way at their annual general meeting. This award is presented to a member of our community for their exceptional leadership, commitment to our community, and volunteer efforts. Len has been involved in various volunteer programs, including those at the Aberdeen Hospital, the New Horizons Seniors Club, and the United Church of Lyons Brook. Len has given years of dedicated service to the citizens of Pictou West out of the kindness of his heart, and I admire him greatly for his willingness to help our community grow. I congratulate Mr. Thomas on this wonderful achievement and look forward to seeing what he continues to do to remain so involved in our community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Fairview Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, in celebration of Small Business Week, I wanted to share with members an exciting new restaurant that opened recently in my riding. Located at 650 Washmo Lake Drive, Budapest Bistro markets itself as a taste of Hungary with extraordinary food and a casual dining atmosphere. Among the many traditional menu items is a Transylvanian goulash, a pork stew with homemade Hungarian spicy sausage, several types of schnitzel, including Budapest, Parisienne, and Viennese style. There are even vegetarian options, including roasted veggies, stuffed peppers, gnocchi with roasted heirloom tomatoes, and a spinach and mushroom moussaka. Klakinski, which are traditional flour crepes, which I'm sure I've mispronounced, made with local eggs and filled with host-made seasonal jam, is one of several mouth-watering dessert items on the menu. And now I'm very hungry, no pun intended. Mr. Speaker, I'm excited to have another great restaurant in my community, and I encourage all members to come and enjoy some traditional Hungarian food and hospitality, and to join me in congratulating the Budapest Bistro on a successful opening. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to draw the House's attention to the West Gallery opposite to us. We have Cumberland County Councillor Mary Ann Jackson, if she'd like to take a stand. But more importantly, her husband, Kenny John Jackson, as some of the opposition might know him, is candidate of record up in Cumberland South for the Liberal Party. And jokes on Kenny, he thought he was coming here to do business for the municipality, but I'll re-enter, Mr. Speaker, if I can make a statement.
The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge the grand opening of the Spring Hill Pit Pond Trail in July 2019. The Spring Hill Pit Pond Trail was the vision of 98-year-old June Hedwood of Spring Hill. 20 years ago, June drew up a map of the features she would like to see around the pit pond and how she would like to see it developed. The trail around the pit pond links to the downtown of Spring Hill, McGee Street, and includes bridges, fountains, lookouts that extend into the water, a bandstand, a park, and a fountain, and a trail that I myself took part in a 5K run a couple weeks ago. June's dream has now become a reality thanks to the hard work of the community and the volunteer hours of many, but especially Kenny John Jackson, who poured his heart and soul in it for the last 12 months of this project. I ask you that you acknowledge the dreams of June's and the hard work and dedication of many, especially the Spring Hill Community Blooms and the hard work guidance of Kenny John Jackson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to welcome the decision announced on Friday by the Minister of Justice that the practice of street checks will be banned permanently across Nova Scotia. Because there is no legal basis for the practice. This decision comes after not months, not years, but decades of work by many different individuals, groups, and organizations. I want to highlight the important contribution of Kirk Johnson. In 2003, a human rights inquiry found that Halifax Regional Police had discriminated against Mr. Johnson on the basis of his race. The inquiry ordered Halifax Regional Police to begin collecting race-based data on interactions with police. That data was not analyzed for many years, but thanks to some reporting by CBC journalists and then advocacy and activism from many African Nova Scotians and their allies, the Human Rights Commission engaged Dr. Scott Wortley to analyze that data further, resulting in more clear evidence of the disproportionate policing of African Nova Scotians and eventually Friday's announcement. Thank you.
The honourable member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to beg to do an introduction.
Permission granted.
Okay, I would ask everyone to look at the East Gallery. Members of the Scottish Rite Learning Centres. Thelma Gregan, Executive Director, if you would mind standing. Thelma Gregan, Executive Director of Scottish Rite Learning Centre, Halifax. Matt Todd, National Executive Director of the Scottish Rite Learning Centres, and others that may be there. Bill Bent, Dyslexia Tutor, Scottish Rite Halifax. Representing everyone's Red Nova Scotia Parent Lead Advocacy Group, Beth Hartling. Kevin O'Halloran, Angela McKenzie, Peggy Alexidis Brown, Kelly Stevens Perry, Claire Robertson, and Kermit DeYounger. Possible other is Jamie Matasala, Chair of Learning Disabilities, Mount St. Vincent University. I'll ask you to remain standing.
The honourable member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank.
Mr. Speaker, October is Dyslexia Awareness Month. To mark this occasion, Province House will be lit up in red, the color of dyslexia awareness. 2 to 3 children in every classroom are impacted by dyslexia. This important campaign, including the proclamation and the lighting up of the House of Assembly, are important steps on the part of ensuring every student in Nova Scotia experiences early diagnostics assessment. And regarding pedagogies, these results in grade appropriate reading fluency. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to join all the members in the House in celebration of the exceptional contribution of Dyslexia Nova Scotians this October. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to congratulate Matt Cove of Amherst. Matt had his first novel, Arctera, published back in February. Matt, who was very interested in animation, had originally planned for his work to be a television series. He has since turned it into a series of novels. With the help of his fiancée and mother, Matt had his novel edited and published and plans to publish the second book in late 2020. I wish Matt the best in his new journey as an author and would like to thank him today for adding to the culture of Cumberland County and wish him success as he continues to tell his story. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Hammonds Plains, Lucasville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I'll recognize Sergeant Ken Burton, a 32-year member of the HRP who was recently recognized with a Police Exemplary Service Medal, which is given to police officers who have served in an exemplary manner characterized by good conduct, industry and efficiency, and who have served at least 20 years of full-time service. Service bars are awarded for each subsequent 10 years of service, Mr. Speaker. Sergeant Burton has worked in many divisions, including the drug section, general investigation services, community response, and is now the lead instructor and director of the latest recruit class. Ken and his wife and 3 daughters have lived in Hammonds Plains for over 25 years, where Ken has also been involved as a soccer coach with Halifax County United and Soccer Nova Scotia, leading teams to nationals on several occasions. I would ask all the members of the House to join me in congratulating Sergeant Ken Burton for having this honour bestowed upon him, and thank you for his dedicated service to the people of Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The honourable member for Queen Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This past August 9th, the impressive new office and processing plant for Mersey Seafoods Limited were officially opened in Liverpool. This venture was very community-minded, and many local people were consulted and involved in the project, making the new building a very special place. To name a few, Brian Fralick worked on the interior design, Henry Leott refurbished many nautical artifacts, Jack Chandler showcased vintage photographs, and Ivan Nickerson created exquisite furniture using the original linden trees from the property. Mr. Speaker, I would like to congratulate and thank the Murphy family, the entire staff of Mersey Seafoods, and everyone who played a part in making this beautiful new facility a reality. The special personal touches makes it especially meaningful to the community on many different levels. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, on this Small Business Week, I'd like to recognize Chantel Boat, owner of the Raven Espresso Boutique, located at 14 St. Michael's Avenue in Spryfield. The Raven Espresso Boutique serves up fresh coffee, mochas, teas, and treats out of the cutest little camper you will ever see. While the camper may be small, the heart and hard work of Chantel is massive. Thank you, Chantel, for choosing our community to invest in and for bringing your flair and delicious drinks and foods to our community. Here's to many more years of success. See you tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize the outstanding work of Dartmouth East resident Leslie Ellesmere. I've met with Leslie on a few occasions and appreciate her advocacy for preventative health care. For the past 4 years, Leslie has served as the event director for Strides for Obesity. Mr. Speaker, on Saturday, October 19th, I had the opportunity to attend the Strides for Obesity walk in Halifax. This annual walk is organized by Leslie and many other volunteers who wish to break down the stigma surrounding obesity. The purpose of the walk is to offer support and to eliminate the bias associated with the disease. Those who are in attendance are calling on the government to make sure that obesity is treated as a disease by allowing for increased access to safe and effective medical treatment. Mr. Speaker, in the past 3 years, this annual walk has raised $30,000 for the QE2's Halifax Obesity Network Clinic. I ask all members of the House to acknowledge and commend Leslie Ellesmere and the volunteers and participants with Strides for Obesity for their amazing work in raising money and awareness. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Lunenburg.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Lisa Alley Learning of Mahone Bay, founder and CEO of Atlantic Tick Repellent Products Incorporated, who was recently named recipient of the 2019 RBC Canadian Women Entrepreneurs Award, One to Watch. This national award recognizes female entrepreneurs who demonstrate incredible potential through their innovative ideas, keen business sense, and solid plans for future profitable growth. Atlantic Tick Repellent Products, in partnership with Acadia University, created a safe, effective, natural-based formula to prevent tick bites. As we are becoming more aware of debilitating effects of Lyme disease and the ticks that play host to this disease, there was a need for a natural-based product that helped to prevent tick bites. Lisa saw this need and created Atlantic Tick, offering an evidence-based approach to tick bite safety. Mr. Speaker, I ask that you and all members of this House of Assembly join me in congratulating Lisa on receiving this well-deserved national award. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to bring recognition to the South Woodside Community Association. The association executive are President Ann Colbert, Vice President Ken Evans, Secretary Bernadette Cranford, and Treasurer Janet Mossman, and other stakeholders who attend. Together, the association runs the South Woodside Community Centre, offering community members an opportunity to stay fit and involved. They are always proudly representing a post-secondary bursary each year to Dartmouth High School. The association also holds an annual pumpkin party. This is a time each fall where families are brought together to pick and carve pumpkins, have a light snack, and play some games. The entire event costs are covered by the association and will be held on October 26th this year. I ask all members of the Nova Scotia Legislature to join me in thanking the South Woodside Community Association for their hard work and so graciously giving back to our community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Clayton Park West.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to congratulate the Dumbrak Under-13 AA girls soccer team on their very successful season. After winning the Nova Scotia Under-13 AA Girls Soccer League, they qualified to represent Nova Scotia at the Atlantic Club Championship in Moncton last month. Throughout the tournament, the girls fought hard and maintained a positive attitude. After 4 tough days and going undefeated, Dumbrak was able to win gold. I am so proud of these girls, not only for their athletic ability, but their incredible level of sportsmanship. These girls embody a wonderful sense of team spirit, that allows them to be such positive role models to the younger players in their club. Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate the girls, the coaching staff, and the parents who helped the team in all their successes this season. I look forward to watching these girls continue in their success and their soccer career in the seasons to come. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to commend Lawrence Reginato on his volunteer efforts in the most recent Myra Ferry Fair. This event is the longest running community fair in Nova Scotia, which is held on Albert Bridge, Cape Breton. This fair relies on its volunteers each year to come out to assist areas such as explaining exhibits, judging events, and helping visitors in any way possible. And this year was no different. Although there are many volunteers who make this fair a success, I would like to applaud Lawrence Reginato on his efforts, which included helping to organize the fair, tending to animals, and ensuring they were cared for and had a place to rest. Members of the community, Lawrence and his family, are well known for their love of horses and farm animals. This year, 3 generations of Reginatos participated in several events and played important roles in a fair that brings so many people of all ages together within and around the community. I stand here once again, Mr. Speaker, to praise Lawrence Reginato to his volunteer efforts with the Myra Ferry Fair and his continued support of this community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Acknowledge the immense work and commitment by members of the African Nova Scotian community to get to the announcement we heard on Friday that the illegal and racist practice of street checks will now be banned in Nova Scotia. As we heard when the Wortley report was released, the discussions over street checks have been taking place since the days of Quacha House and probably long before that. Members of the African Nova Scotian community have been calling for this practice to end for decades. People like Lynn Jones, Robert Wright, Shauna Hoyt, Lana McLean, Elle Jones, Kate McDonald, Trayvon Clayton, Vanessa Fells, and many, many others have been vocal leaders calling for justice for African Nova Scotians who are stopped up to 6 times more than white people by the police. Mr. Speaker, this ban, which followed the legal opinion of Justice Michael MacDonald and Jennifer Taylor that street checks are an illegal practice, is a step in the direction of real justice for African Nova Scotian people. It took too long to get here, but now may we look forward and listen to the community's call for justice and an end to anti-black racist practices in our province.
The honourable member for Kings South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I do my member statement, may I make an introduction, please?
Permission granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask all members of the House to draw your attention to the East Gallery, where today we're joined by my CA. All members of this House know how important these public servants are in their work serving the public and serving the MLAs. So I'm very, very fortunate to have a young gentleman who works very hard, brings lots of talents to the job in his service to the constituents of Kings South. So I'd like to ask Carmen Kerr to rise and receive the warm welcome of the House. Mr. Speaker, in honor of Small Business Week, I would like to take this opportunity to profile a very successful export business in Nova Scotia, a one-of-a-kind business located in Grand Pré, Fireworks FX, owned by Fred Wade. When we enjoy a fireworks display, we may not always think of the pyrotechnic expertise and professionalism behind these spectacular shows, but for over 35 years, that's exactly what Fireworks FX has exported throughout the world. Fred has been responsible for fireworks at the Quebec Winter Carnival, the Festival of Lights in Halifax and Sydney, and throughout the world he's coordinated the International Symposium on Fireworks, the world's premier international gathering of the pyrotechnic industry. Fireworks FX has also applied their pyrotechnic services to the motion picture, television, and theatrical industries, simulating explosions and burning buildings or boats. Next month, Fireworks FX will take their pyrotechnic expertise to Havana, Cuba, to celebrate the city's 500th anniversary. I invite all members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly to join me in congratulating Fred Wade for building this world-class international business in pyrotechnics. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to congratulate Enactus St. Mary's Square Roots. Square Roots began their fall pilot project on September 28, 2019, and will continue monthly. The next 2 dates are planned for October 26th and November 23rd. Operating out of the recently renovated Fennerty Room at the Sackville Public Library, their goal is to have perfectly good food from local restaurants and farms that would have been thrown out redirected into the hands of those in need in our community. Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask all members of the Nova Scotia Legislature to join me in thanking those involved with Square Roots and wish them luck with their fall project as they make efforts to find ways to reduce the amount of food that is thrown out daily by having it benefit the needy in our community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Pence Elementary School Kindness Group, with students from grades 3 to 6, spread goodwill and kindness throughout their school and community. They brainstorm who they would like to do a good deed for, then do some research, fundraise, and make it happen. The group has made cookies and cards for school staff and muffins for firefighters. They've learned valuable lessons as well. They did an activity on gossiping, on the harm it causes, and have learned about paying it forward, as well as the importance of volunteering from their local firefighters. Nicole Roach, the pre-primary teacher and program lead, says the children have a kind nature and want to give a part of themselves to the community. It's important to foster that desire now and make it fun so it will continue to be a value they have as they get older. She also says that we throw in some physical activity during the meetings too, which is important. Next year, they're excited to work with groups and organizations such as Souls Harbor Rescue Mission, hospitals, and the food bank, to name a few. I'd like the members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly to join me in thanking the Kindness Group for showing concerns for others and making the world around them a better place. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Autism Pictou County hosted another very successful fundraiser in June of 2019. A boisterous crowd of over 300 participants joined the Walk for Autism. A sea of red shirts walked through the town of Sellerton to promote autism awareness. The event raised over $70,000 and will ensure their programs and supports will continue for another year. The Autism Resource Centre will expand and improve numerous programs and services. The Autism Swim program was very successful with 56 children enrolled this year. The art, skating, and music therapy programs have raised the bar for support, and the children have made great strides. Pictou County's overwhelming support has made a positive impact on the lives of families living and dealing with autism. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Bedford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Joyful. That's the way many people at Bedford United Church describe Barry Cameron. Barry has a deep commitment to caring for people, so it's no surprise he's been a dedicated volunteer at Bedford United for over 7 years. Barry's been the chair of worship and a choir member for those 7 years. He's also volunteered as music leader during the summers, and he's an active member of church council. Barry's known as an extremely personable and friendly figure at Bedford United. He has a busy day job, but he somehow finds time and an astonishing amount of energy to commit to the church. He's a stalwart member of the congregation and always goes out of his way to make certain he helps in the best and most meaningful ways possible. He does it all with joy. Barry Cameron is an asset to BUC and was recognized for his contributions to the church at the Bedford Volunteer Awards in May. I'd like to add my voice to those thanking him for his time and his commitment to his fellow residents. Well done.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musquedominit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During Autism Awareness Month, Lachlan Innes, a Dutch Settlement Elementary School student with autism and ADHD, not only researched and created a class presentation, but he presented his project to every class in his school. As he said during an interview, I had a lot of facts about autism and I presented it to every single class. The presentation was, in fact, so well received that he was also invited to present at the Musquedominit Valley Education Centre. I wish to praise Lachlan on his bravery and his consideration into sharing his experiences and expertise on the subject of autism. In his own words, people with autism should get more chances, same with other people, and they should live in harmony. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During Small Business Week, I am pleased to introduce this House to two enterprising women from Colchester North. The North Shore Business Development Association established an inaugural award, a prize, and a mentorship opportunity from business owners in the community. From the many applications, two were actually accepted, one by Shannon Dahlberg and one by Pamela Craig. The board was so impressed with their caliber of their presentations that they decided to give each of them them an award. Pamela Craig has worked for a number of local small businesses. Having grown her own herbs, fruits, and vegetables, she decided she could work for herself. Her business is called Dry Humor Dehydrated Goodness. She uses her dehydrated produce to make such delicious items as fruit roll-ups and apple chips. Shannon Dahlberg's business is known as Mountain Mead Works. At an early age, she was working with her father making beer and began experimenting with mead during her college years. Mead consists of honey, water, and yeast and is similar to cider. A variety of flavors can be added, and Shannon uses most local ingredients. Both of the winners live in Earltown, Colchester North, and both sold their products at the Earltown Farmers Market. Congratulations to these two enterprising women who have successfully used their entrepreneurial skills to develop a small local business.
The honourable member for Clare Digby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we are aware, eating a variety of fresh fruits and vegetables daily is an important part of a healthy diet. Unfortunately, there are many people who find it difficult to eat healthy because of the cost or lack of access nearby. Seniors living alone don't need to buy a large quantity of food, so their purchases often lack a variety of needs in their diets. Also, distances, as it's almost 2 hours to go from Briar Island to grocery stores in Digby, this is another factor. This past summer, representatives of the Nova Scotia Health Authority and from local groups and businesses worked together to make it possible for people to buy a variety of produce through the Fresh Food Box program. For the past 21 weeks, this pilot program delivered affordable boxes of produce from local farms and the Digby Superstore to sites in Digby and the municipality of Digby. This program was a great way to encourage people to eat healthy, and hopefully its success this summer will ensure its return next summer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to congratulate the Port Williams community and Port Williams Village Chairperson and Commissioner Lewis Benedict, the Village Vice Chairperson and Commissioner Kim Cogswell, Commissioners Ernie Hovel, Doug Gates, Scott Lear, and the people of the Village of Port Williams for receiving the Nova Scotia Lieutenant Governor's Community Spirit Award. This honour is awarded to communities for their exemplary civic and community spirit. It celebrates the power, strength, and diversity of the community and profiles their achievements through a formal recognition program. Together with 15 other community organizations, the Port Williams History Committee prepared the village's submission. This was possible as many citizens belong to more than one group, which results in a cross-pollination of ideas, support for each other's projects, and a willingness to work together on village-wide events. I would like to thank the citizens and community organizations for their continued dedication to creating successful community projects and events, and as a resident of Port Williams, I am very proud the community has been recognized with this award. Thank you to all who contribute to making Port Williams such a great place to live. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Preston Dartmouth. Oops.
Now, very often I get ahead of Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize Mr. Ross Simmons of East Preston, founder of Foundation Marketing, who is this year's chair of the Black Business Summit at Halifax Convention Centre. He was tasked to provide oversight to ensure that the content delivered at the summit was related to technology and business. His background is in technology, and he is well suited to delivering the Black Business Institute Summit on creating business without barriers. I want to recognize and congratulate Ross Simmons for his entrepreneurial drive and technology expertise in business.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, on Saturday night, the streets of Halifax and Dartmouth were transformed by the incredible art that was part of Nocturne's Public Art Festival. I spent my evening on the Dartmouth side of the harbour and was treated to some amazing exhibits all along Portland Street, which adopted the theme of Electric Avenue for the night. Highlights for my family and me were the Cabana Sucre by Louis-Charles Dion, the Maturity Playground by Nathalie Quagliotti, the gorgeous Botanic Variations by Tracy Richard, Angie Richard, and Hyacinth Rainbow, and Keeping Occupied, an installation of giant handmade octopuses by Rita Van Tassel. We rounded out the evening by taking in the Council of Absurd Urbanization by Théâtre des Assimilés, where we were able to contribute our ideas to a reimagined HRM. The presence of works of art in our midst, Mr. Speaker, is a vital and exciting part of life. After looking at an exhibit for a while, my daughter asked me, what makes something art? And the discussion that we had after that was the best part of my night. Congratulations to all the artists, curators, and organizers of Nocturne. I ask all members of this House to join me in thanking them for their contributions to our society.
The Honourable Member for Antigonish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are many great things about my community of Antigonish. One of those features, Mr. Speaker, is that we're served by 2 members of Parliament. And I'd just like to take a moment, Mr. Speaker, to congratulate Sean Fraser on his re-election in Central Nova, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to also offer my congratulations to my MP, rookie Mike Callaway, on his election to Cape Breton Canso. Wish them all the luck, best of success on behalf of the people of their respective ridings, but in particular the people of Antigonish when they go to Ottawa. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to bring the House's attention to the East Gallery, where we're joined by 2 distinguished guests. Councillor Marianne Jackson is here with us today, and of course her famous or infamous husband, former Liberal candidate, RCMP officer, Kenny John Jackson. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the Chamber.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to commemorate the young athletes of the Northumberland Regional High School in Alma. I particularly want to recognize 2019 graduates Jessica Trevors and Glenn Cox on being awarded Female Male Athlete of the Year, respectively. Both teens have been involved in various sports throughout their high school career. Jessica has played sports including rugby and volleyball, and Glenn has been involved in basketball and ultimate frisbee. These young athletes have put in years of hard work and remain dedicated to their sports. The recognition from the teachers and coaches from NRHS during their graduating year is well-deserved and an incredible achievement. I salute these young adults for their years of hard work, and I am glad that these members of our community can act as role models to younger students in Pictou West. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to say, Mr. Speaker, that Brookfield Bakery is now in Elmsdale. A long-time landmark in Brookfield, this bakery has been part of the Brookfield community since 1953. And I'm happy to say that they have expanded to the popular Elmsdale location. They are now serving breakfast, lunch, and snacks to our appreciative community. Their coffee and tea menu is extensive, and the atmosphere is a magnet to their clientele. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the people of Hants East, I'd like to thank the owners, Joanne and Heidi Cook, for their vision, and the managers Shannon McClellan and Josh Archibald for their tasty, friendly smiles and scrumptious cinnamon rolls. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Argyll-Barrington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize Dr. Peter Loveridge of Lower Argyll, Yarmouth County. This year marks 50 years since Dr. Loveridge graduated with distinction from medical college at the Royal London Hospital, and it is his 45th year working as a physician in Yarmouth County. Dr. Loveridge was honoured in 2010 by the Society of Rural Physicians of Canada with a Fellowship of Rural and Remote Medicine. Now in his 70s, Dr. Loveridge still sees patients part-time at his clinic and is the primary physician at Nikhil Home for Special Care. Instead of retiring, Dr. Loveridge has recently signed a contract with the province to continue providing part-time service in his community. Dr. Loveridge with his wife, Heather, are soon preparing to set sail on the Queen Mary 2 from New York to England, where he will attend his 50th graduation reunion. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members of this House to join me in thanking Dr. Peter Loveridge for his 45 years of dedication to his patients in southwestern Nova Scotia. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise here this afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to rise. This, the People's House, Mr. Speaker, where we represent democracy. Each and every one of us who've ever gone through a campaign knows what that's like, the fight that can be, and the fun that can be out there with your other candidates and colleagues, Mr. Speaker. And I want to rise today to thank all those who ran in the recent federal election right across this province, regardless of their party affiliation, Mr. Speaker. It's important to get out there to put your name on the ballot. And I want to congratulate our young man, Cody Blois, who won in King's Hants. Scott Bryson, as you know, represented that seat for 20 years, and nice to see folks out there, but I want to congratulate Cody as well and all those who won here in Nova Scotia last night. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to congratulate and acknowledge Justin Symes and his family and their outstanding community spirit. For the past 20 years, Justin and his family have staged a haunted house for the Halloween season on the Valley Road near Spring Hill. It first began on their property on Church Street in Spring Hill, and they carried on the tradition when they moved to the Valley Road, being able to add more and more every year because of the extra space. This year in the form of a zombie field. Justin claims they have had many people who have been in the helped out in the construction of the haunted house and the trail, and many have sponsored with time of help and equipment over the past 20 years. Being able to small fee, all proceeds go to the home and school programs. Please join me in congratulating Justin and his family on these 20 years of providing the excitement and community spirit around this time of year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to thank the Clean Foundation for hosting a Fix-It Fair at the Brewery Market on Sunday. I attended with my children, and while my daughter made a craft with recycled fabric and shredded newspaper, my son and I watched the Clean Foundation's professional tinkerers fix our broken toaster and put a new switch on my reading lamp. I'm hoping that Ben, my son, may take on tinkering duties in our home with new ambition thanks to their example. I also got to test drive an electric car through EV Assist, and it was a really fun Sunday afternoon for us all, and I think that is so important. Sometimes when we talk about changing our lifestyles to be more in alignment with the planet, that is cast as a deprivation, but in fact it can come with rewards that include more community connection, creativity, and opportunities to learn. Thank you.
The honourable member for Guysborough Eastern Shore Tracadie.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in recognition of Bronwyn Nogler of Sheet Harbour for her skill and grace in ballet. Bronwyn is only 15 years old and is already wowing people with her dancing skills. Bronwyn has been taking ballet lessons since the age of 6 and is supported by her parents, Chris and Krista. She also performs many other styles of dance with her competitive dance troupe, Harmony. Bronwyn has been invited to Toronto to participate in the Trixie Hardy Dance Scholarship twice. She was one of the 90 ballet students from across Canada chosen by the Ballet Examiner. Keen to give back, Bronwyn performed at the Sheet Harbour Lions Centre fundraiser in support of the Eastern Shore Lifestyle Centre Society, working on their new community centre. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to commend Bronwyn on her performance in support of the Eastern Shore Lifestyle Centre. By all accounts, it was lovely. I'm sure we'll see much more of Bronwyn as her dancing talent continues to grow and gain recognition. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Emmons Plains Lucasville on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like all members to direct their attention to the East Gallery. We're joined by my friend and neighbor, I guess former neighbor, Clark Swim. He was a big help on my first campaign, and he's been helping my folks keep me out of trouble for many years, I think, at this point. So all members, please welcome him to the House today.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to recognize Small Business Week. In Cumberland North, we have hundreds of many businesses in many sectors, including mining, forestry, manufacturing, energy, agriculture, retail sectors. Entrepreneurs and their employees are truly the foundation of our economy in Cumberland North and throughout the province of Nova Scotia. I'd like to mention, Mr. Speaker, that tonight the Amerson Area Chamber of Commerce are holding a gala awards banquet to honour the businesses of Cumberland County. Though Tori and I, my colleague from Cumberland South and I are unable to attend due to our commitments here in the House, we would like to wish the Amerson Area Chamber of Commerce thanking them for honouring the businesses during Small Business Week. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sydney Whitney Pier.
Very quickly, Mr. Speaker, it's the birthday for the member from Emmons Plains Lucasville. I think he started when he was 18 years old, but he's 33 today. So, happy birthday.
We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The honourable leader of the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Premier confirmed that the vessel that's currently docked in Yarmouth will be operating on the route next year if it gets going. I'll table the Premier's comments on that for his benefit. The vessel, the Alakai, assuming it gets operational, would operate through some of the richest fishing grounds in the world. It would also operate through an area that is home to dozens of humpback whales and many other whale species. It's not uncommon for an environmental impact study for a vessel to be done. We can't find an environmental impact study on the Department of the Environment website for this particular vessel, the Alakai. My question for the Premier is, was an environmental impact study ever conducted on the Alakai vessel to his knowledge?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. He would know the arrangements between Bay Ferries and the U.S. Navy, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the vessel. That vessel, like all vessels, Mr. Speaker, we put through the same criteria and rigor, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to navigation.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In its former life, the Alakai ran a ferry service in Hawaii. And while in Hawaii, that vessel was initially exempt from environmental impact requirements after legislation was specifically passed to exempt that vessel. That law was later struck down by the state Supreme Court. And when it forced the Alakai out of operation in Hawaii, and I can table that for the benefit of the Premier. It was taken out of service there, Mr. Speaker, until it could find a home here, I guess. But it appears that no work was done on an environmental impact study on the vessel here in this province. And now that the Premier has indicated that the lease will be renewed, I'd like to ask the Premier, was the Premier aware of the environmental concerns surrounding the Alakai before agreeing to have it renewed to operate here?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable for his question. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, that the contractual obligation between Bay Ferries and the U.S. Navy, Mr. Speaker. What happened with that vessel in Hawaii, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure, but I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, it would follow and have to follow all of the navigational requirements in order to be traveled, Mr. Speaker, here on the east coast of North America and in the Bay of Fundy.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that the taxpayers of this province paid $20 million for a vessel just this year that's not operating. The taxpayers of this province are paying for a vessel that is not allowed to operate in Hawaii for environmental concerns. Those are the realities. And the specific concerns in Hawaii were around the potential for whale impacts with that vessel. And humpback whale impacts are a concern for us here in our region as well. And again, the Alakai, if it ever gets operational, will travel through very rich fishing grounds that are home to many humpback whales. I'd like to ask the Premier, is the Premier concerned that the taxpayers of Nova Scotia are paying to lease a vessel that's not even allowed to operate in Hawaii, and would he commit to getting environmental impact study done for it here?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member often in this House stretches, Mr. Speaker, his interpretation of all kinds of things. Mr. Speaker, the reality is this is a contract between Bay Ferries, Mr. Speaker, and the U.S. Navy. He would also know those are federal waters. They would have to meet all of those requirements. He would also know the last federal government, which was re-elected last night, Mr. Speaker, is it made the requirements in and around whale traffic in those particular areas for all vessels, including not only the ferry but also Navy, Mr. Speaker. The reality of it is the Honourable Member is clearly opposed to this service, Mr. Speaker, and I respect that. That he's opposed to it. We're not. Unfortunately, he just won't say that in communities, Mr. Speaker. On one hand, he says something here, and then when he goes down to those communities, Mr. Speaker, oops, I mean something different.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Would like to ask the Premier, Mr. Speaker, about the roadmap for transforming the Nova Scotia Services to Persons with Disabilities
Order,
program.
please. The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party has the floor.
Thank you. When this important report was presented to government in 2013, it included a 5-year implementation program which covered a range of subjects, but most notably the need for persons with disabilities to have access to the same range of affordable, accessible housing and community that everybody else has. And the report then was received by the government, and then its implementation expanded over a 10-year period to 2023, but that means that now we're in year 6, the second half of that period. So I'd like to ask the Premier, is his government still committed to the objectives of housing for disabled persons in Nova Scotia as set out in the roadmap plan?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank all members of the question. We are committed to Mr. Speaker, to ensuring that all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, can live independently in our province. The honourable member would know and raises a very important part. Those Nova Scotians require extra support to live independently, but it's certainly, Mr. Speaker, the mandate of the roadmap and certainly the mandate of our government to strive to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that independence not be the goal, but independence be the reality for those Nova Scotians who want that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, when the roadmap was accepted by the government in 2013, there were 1,035 people on the Disability Supports Program waitlist. But today, there are 1,560 people on that list. That means that the wait list for community-based supportive housing has grown more than 50% over the first 6 years of the 10-year period for implementation of the project. So I want to ask the Premier if he can explain how he plans to meet the commitment his government has made to the more than 1,500 people who are on that wait list now.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member raises an extremely important question, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to ensuring that we have many options when it comes to independent living. Some of those, Mr. Speaker, require physical builds that we provide that, Mr. Speaker. Other parts of that is working with families, Mr. Speaker, with adult children who are looking to live independently. How do we support them to ensure that that happens? Mr. Speaker, I was surprised to learn that if a family wanted to build a separate unit attached to their property, Mr. Speaker, that was completely independent next to the parents, that we would not allow at one point their adult child to live there. We had to have complete separation from that family. Mr. Speaker, we know that those initiatives are important steps to help people live independence, and we'll continue, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that we have or provide a myriad of options for those families and for all citizens, Mr. Speaker, because ultimately what we want, Mr. Speaker, is have independence.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
As I'm sure the Premier is aware, a Human Rights Board of Inquiry has found that the unnecessary institutionalization of people with disabilities is in fact a violation of their human rights. The board ruled that the province had violated the human rights of Beth McLean, Joey Delaney, and the late Sheila Livingston by failing to provide those housing options. So is the Premier confident that his government's approach to the roadmap is not in violation of the human rights of all the people with disabilities in Nova Scotia who continue to lack access to affordable and accessible housing in the community?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the honourable for the question. He is very right, Mr. Speaker. There was a tribunal. He specified 3 cases. Mr. Speaker, we are working with those families, as we are with all of our families, Mr. Speaker, to move towards independence. The reality of it is there are not only those, Mr. Speaker, who are actually in the care of the province today or an institution in the province, there are those who are still living at home. We see a growing number of those families as well who are looking for independence for their children. They're young adults, Mr. Speaker. The reality of it is we have put together small options homes, which is allowing that transition to provide that supports of independence. Families very clearly say to us, leaving from home and going directly to independent living is a challenge sometimes. We need to be able to move into those small options. But that is, Mr. Speaker, in many ways a stopgap till we move them completely to independent living, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On January 1st, 2018, the wait list for those looking for a family doctor was 41,877. I'll table that and maybe the Premier take a look at that. Today, well, actually October 1st, the wait list is 51,014. I'll table that for the benefit of the Premier. So maybe pass it right to the Premier. The wait list is longer today than it was just less than 2 years ago. We're seeing surgeries canceled in Sydney because of doctor shortages. We're seeing the oncology units in Pictou and Yarmouth canceled because of specialist shortages. I'd like to ask the Premier, after 6 years into his mandate, in light of the fact that the wait list continued to grow, does the Premier stand by his promise of a doctor for every Nova Scotian?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, a year ago, Mr. Speaker, that wait list was at 59,000, Mr. Speaker. That number continues to come down. We're continuing to work with families across the province and work with communities to continue to provide those supports, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member would know he stood in this place many times and said 100,000 Nova Scotians didn't have a physician 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker. So even by his own numbers, Mr. Speaker, more Nova Scotians are accessing primary care.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
I'm not sure if the Premier was here, Mr. Speaker, but I just tabled a document that said it was 42,000 less than 2 years ago. It's 51,000 today. Those are numbers from the Nova Scotia Health Authority, and the Premier can make up his own, but the fact is 51,000 Nova Scotians don't have access to a family doctor. And health officials that appeared before the Public Accounts Committee indicated that only half the people that actually need a family doctor are actively seeking. They said that at that time, there was probably 100,000 Nova Scotians looking for a family doctor. That would still be true, Mr. Speaker. 51,000 on the data that has showed the Premier. If only half look, it's still 100,000. Still 100,000. People are worried about their ability to access health care. I'll ask the Premier one more time. Does he stand by his promise of a doctor for every Nova Scotian or not?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I appreciate the honourable member's question. It's good to hear him finally say something positive, Mr. Speaker, about the health authority and the hardworking people who have been out providing support and looking for the transformation of delivering primary care. He takes every opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to stand in this House and criticize those who are working on behalf of all of us, not the elected.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
From a document, Mr. Speaker, that he says was 41,000, Mr. Speaker, that the health authority's number. I would ask the honourable member then why does he stand in this House and continue to use the number of 100,000? Did he know, Mr. Speaker, that wasn't factual at that time?
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Minister of Lands and Forestry about the situation in our forests. And one particular situation that I have in mind is a patch of old-growth forest in the St. Mary's River watershed. An FOI request returned to our caucus showed a series of applications to the department made last year by the gold company St. Barbara's, formerly Atlantic Gold, to drill in over 100 locations in the St. Mary's River watershed. Around a dozen were directly inside an old-growth area, all of them taking place on Crown land. The compromise from the department was to allow drilling not inside but directly abutting the old growth area. Can the minister please confirm that this decision is consistent with the need to strengthen protections of old growth forests and the need to protect the St. Mary's River watershed, both priorities signalled by this government?
The Honourable Minister of Lands and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. We continue to make a lot of progress in protecting more area in the province, St. Mary's River being one of them. That's a large piece that has an important wildlife corridor. We've committed to that along with 7,000 other hectares of protected areas recently. We also continue to look at old growth layers across the province, and we'll be adding more to that protected areas. It's a priority recommendation in the Leahy report, and we have a project team that's working very diligently with external experts, and they're doing a great job identifying and looking at areas across the province for further protection, because it is important to protect those old growth forests. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, there is a rich history of community-led science and conservation efforts in the St. Mary's River watershed, where biologists and fisheries scientists have determined that the salmon's return across the province is dependent on populations in the St. Mary's River. The Nova Scotia Nature Trust has invested in protecting the area, and it's home to a burgeoning tourism industry. And all of this stands to be threatened by the proposal for an open-pit gold mine. Given the urgent need to shift to ecological forestry and the significant threat posed by an open-pit gold mine, how has the community been allowed to participate in decisions to allow drilling in the St. Mary's River watershed?
The Honourable Minister of Lands and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we continue to evolve our natural resource-based industries in the province. We have strong regulations. We continue to look at improving those. We actually have setbacks for forestry activity or other types of industrial activity in sensitive sensitive areas or any areas that are protected. So we have buffer zones, we have lots of areas where we make sure that we put ecology first. And as I said, we're making great progress, making our milestones that we've committed to when we responded to the Leahy report, implementing ecological forestry. I continue to engage our external experts and all those Nova Scotians that are interested. And I want to thank those groups like Nova Scotia Nature Trust that are working very hard alongside Nature Conservancy and Ducks Unlimited and all the other groups that we work hand in hand with to protect the most highest biodiversity values in the province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. While we await the replacement of the VG in Halifax, the hospital reported a number of suspicious incidents over the first half of the year. One report found an unauthorized individual wearing a lab coat and a surgical mask in a patient's room, passing himself off as a physician. And, Mr. Speaker, I'll table that. Another individual was found sleeping in a waiting room late at night with a woodworking blade. And I can table that as well, Mr. Speaker. The details of these incidents are generally not clear, and we're wondering how many are related and whether they're ongoing and continuing. We can't find that out. So it raises multiple questions about the safety of patients, families, and hospital staff. So I'd like to ask the Minister, how can unauthorized persons gain after-hours access to patients and patient floors at the VG?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly patient and staff as well. The safety of all individuals in our hospital facilities throughout the province is important, Mr. Speaker. That's why whenever there's a safety incident, Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia Health Authority takes steps to first and foremost address and bring the situation under control to re-establish the safety of the environment. And, Mr. Speaker, take corrective action then to ensure that any controls that need to be put in place or modified are conducted going forward.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his answer. However, when an individual is charged in these cases, it is made known to the public, and they become fearful. In one case of multiple trespasses at the VG, the threat was clearly neutralized, but this is not always the case, and it has been pointed out that several of the threats could not be confirmed, nor could the individuals allegedly involved be identified. As this is an ongoing concern for the VG, I'd like to ask the Minister, what exactly has been done recently to make the VG hospital more secure?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, the safety of both patients, staff, visitors, really all people who enter our facilities are important. Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia Health Authority, which operates and manages our hospital facilities, are responsible to ensure that safety as they are with the healthcare delivery within those institutions. Mr. Speaker, they provide security services as part of those facilities, Mr. Speaker, having security guards staff on site as one of the important safeguards to help protect and respond to incidences in those facilities.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Talk to almost any healthcare professional and they'll have a story of having to deal with someone in a crisis. Hospitals and other healthcare facilities see people daily in crisis. And in these facilities, security staff are usually the front line of trying to diffuse a crisis. This could be someone in a mental health crisis or someone threatening to harm themselves or others. It could be individuals who are simply disrupting the functioning of these facilities and making patients or their families uncomfortable. I'd like to ask the Minister, what kind of specific training do security guards receive before working at the province's hospitals, where they often come in contact with individuals facing mental health distress?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As previously mentioned, the safety of staff and as well as patients and all people in our hospital facilities are important parts of the operation and the delivery of care in these facilities. Mr. Speaker, the training, the specific training that security guards take meet the criteria defined for the positions they fill, Mr. Speaker. But also, Mr. Speaker, there are many healthcare providers who would also be trained in working with individuals. The member specifically inquiring about mental health situation and crisis intervention. Obviously, there's training for those services as well.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, I'm raising these questions because in May, it was reported that a security guard themselves at the QE2 Health Science Centre quit her job after experiencing trauma and being insufficiently trained. She wasn't trained for her responsibilities, and I'll table that story. These responsibilities, Mr. Speaker, included shifts that were the security guard was required to watch over individuals who attempted suicide or perhaps to restrain a patient on her own. And usually that takes 3 people in most incidents. And while this might just be incidents of guards being put into difficult situations, Mr. Speaker, it raises questions, serious questions about how severe mental health distress is addressed in our facility. So I would like to see if the minister would agree that are all mental health patients being left in the care of unprepared security guards because the ERs are simply too backlogged to deal with them?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member knows, Mr. Speaker, as I believe do all members of this legislature, the importance of the conversations that we've had here on this floor and the commitment of government, and as I've previously mentioned, all members of this legislature, to improving the mental health care and services provided to Nova Scotians to ensure that the care that they need is there for them is a priority, one that we all share, Mr. Speaker. And as a government, we continue to work with our partners at the Nova Scotia Health Authority and the IWK to strengthen and target our investments, Mr. Speaker, throughout the province to ensure that we have the care and the services that Nova Scotians need when they are in need of support for their mental wellness.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
We're also talking about having securities there for the actual security guards and helping them. My question's for the Minister of Health. Over the summer, the NSHA was ordered by the Nova Scotia Labour Board to conduct an urgent violence in the workplace assessment at the East Coast Forensic Hospital, and I can table that, Mr. Speaker. In February 2018, a nurse at that hospital was so concerned about her safety and requested a safety assessment that in April 2018, another nurse was punched and kicked by a patient. This nurse was 33 weeks pregnant. I'd like to ask the minister directly, how was a nurse left in such a vulnerable position in her workplace?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Obviously, that's a situation that was referenced that nobody wants to see occur, Mr. Speaker. The fact is, through the review of that situation, there were some deficiencies identified to take place and address, Mr. Speaker, and work has been underway to address those issues that were identified to improve the safety and the security, again, of both patients, Mr. Speaker, and staff and visitors of these facilities.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following this incident, a co-worker of the assaulted nurse that was punched filed a formal complaint over the incident with the Department of Labour and Education. This came months after the NSHA vowed to handle the matter internally. Ultimately, though, Mr. Speaker, the Labour Board agreed with the union of the employee. Not enough was being done to ensure the safety of employees at the East Coast Forensic Hospital. So I'd like to ask the minister to clarify, why did it take an order from the Labour Board to address this issue? And why didn't the NSHA communicate directly with the frontline worker like they should have?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As this particular incident came to the attention of the department and to myself, Mr. Speaker, when the request to respond to recommendations, Mr. Speaker, came forward, we certainly supported the Nova Scotia Health Authority to ensure that work was done, Mr. Speaker, to provide the resources to make sure it was done, because, Mr. Speaker, we do recognize the importance of responding and supporting a safe environment. Mr. Speaker, we've worked with the unions in other facilities throughout the province, Mr. Speaker, particularly in some of our rural communities, to improve the security in our community emergency departments based upon a collaborative work, Mr. Speaker, with the unions representing frontline employees.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. In 2016, Halifax cardiologist Dr. Gabriel Horn received the highest financial award for loss of reputation in Canadian legal history. The NSHA was ordered to award hundreds of thousands of dollars to Dr. Horn after a years-long ordeal that began when the cardiologist refused to add the names of colleagues to her research. Capital Health, which was the NSHA's predecessor in HRM, was found to have acted in administrative bad faith in limiting Dr. Horn's hospital privileges. And yet, Mr. Speaker, the NSHA has never issued a formal apology to Dr. Horn, and I will table that. Can the minister please provide any insight into why the NSHA has never apologized to Dr. Horn for acting in bad faith in a professional setting?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe the particulars of the case that the member has brought to the floor, as she noted, predates my time, Mr. Speaker, in this role. What I can assure the member, though, again, as the incident, the case has been broadly publicized, including the rulings that have played out, Mr. Speaker, and I assure the member the NSHA's responsibility to fulfill those rulings that have come through that process is steps that they are responsible for exercising.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and perhaps the minister wants to take the opportunity today to apologize. It's never too late to apologize. Nova Scotians deserve to feel safe and respected in their workplaces. That expectation is the same for doctors as it is for everyone else. While the NSHA tooted its own respectful workplace policy, Mr. Speaker, Dr. Horn highlighted that actions speak louder than words, and don't we know that in this chamber? Dr. Horn said, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, and we'll table this quote, "The health authority has yet to acknowledge any wrongdoing whatsoever, even after the Court of Appeal decision. Nobody's been held accountable." So I would like to ask the minister, does the minister feel that the NSHA has an accountability problem?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been significant changes, as the member herself has noted, Mr. Speaker, taking place within the organizational structure of what was formerly Capital Health, Mr. Speaker, and what is now the Nova Scotia Health Authority. The fact of the matter is there's been significant organizational, structural and administrative changes within the organizations, Mr. Speaker. The Capital Health as have other health authorities throughout the province been disbanded, and the Nova Scotia Health Authority is a new entity with new leadership running that organization.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. 6 months ago, I asked the Minister of Business about the case of the injured Devco miners of Cape Breton. The minister said at the time he supported the miners and wanted to help them, but at the same time refused to consider making a special amendment to the WCB Act to allow Devco miners to receive extended benefits paid for by the federal government. Mr. Speaker, if the minister isn't willing to entertain the change the miners are requesting, what has he done in the past 6 months to resolve this injustice?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Obviously, this is an issue that's been discussed on the floor of this legislature. This is something that's certainly a federal responsibility that we've always offered to. If there's a way to take that money and be the broker for those funds, we'd be happy to do that. I actually met with the group yesterday, so there's some new things that they want to discuss with the federal representatives down home, and I'll be happy to be part of those meetings just like I always am. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, according to the miners, the minister has not been in touch with them for 6 months, but I guess that's no longer true. This government has the power to make an amendment to the Act allowing the extraordinary exemption for former DevCo miners only. Mr. Speaker, the minister implied that the government cannot amend the Act to protect only one group of workers, but changes to protect only one group of workers have been made in the past, such as the automatic assumption that loss of lung function in coal miners with 20 or more years' experience is a work-related injury. Mr. Speaker, can the minister explain how he can deny the DevCo miners an extraordinary exemption when amendments to protect a single group of workers have been made in the past?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member very well knows, those amendments that were made are not the same as what the DevCo miners are looking for. Although she continues to repeat that and say that publicly, that's not the case, Mr.
Order,
Speaker. And again,
please. The Honourable Minister of Business has the floor.
It's been a very emotional conversation for me. Davis Day was a tough day where some of those miners, including the member from Cape Breton Centre, turned their back on me while I was speaking about the importance of miners, my heritage, my history with mining.
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre will have respect for the chair, please. The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So again, I have nothing to be ashamed of around my work with the miners, my commitment to them. I've been meeting with them for a number of years to understand this issue. It's something that the federal government can change, and if they want to have that conversation, we will have that. I'm very happy about the work we've done in trying to help the miners, and at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, I don't have to hang my head on this one for sure. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. In the last year, the NSHA has begun seriously looking at physician assistants, known as PAs, as a potential solution to the serious problems with primary health care delivery in this province. PAs can't work independent of clinicians, but they can make basic assessments that would otherwise fall to a doctor or a nurse practitioner. So the interim Vice President of Medicine with NSHA has stated that, and I quote, and we'll table this quote, "It's one of the ideas that will help us move the healthcare system along." And a pilot project to hire 3 PAs was announced in the spring. So I'd like to ask the minister, have any PAs begun working at hospitals in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, we know that to respond to the challenges facing our healthcare system, we need to continue to work with and rely on a wide variety of healthcare professionals, ensuring that they have the opportunity to work to their scope of practice, Mr. Speaker. That's why we've supported expansions for nurse practitioners, continuing innovative recruitment initiatives for physicians, and yes, Mr. Speaker, that includes expanding opportunities for new practitioners in the province, like physician assistants. Mr. Speaker, I'd have to check back with the Nova Scotia Health Authority to verify the status of the starts for those physician assistants that will be working as part of the orthopedic program.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
I believe on the website today they're looking for 1 at this point. I thank the minister, though, for his answer. As we know, the healthcare system today still remains in a crisis. Nova Scotians need local health care today, Mr. Speaker. And while I'm pleased to hear of any new initiatives like PAs that might be able to make a positive impact, Nova Scotians want to know when they'll see those initiatives in their own communities. For many rural Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, asking them to wait another 2 or 3 years or 4 years for something resembling a solution is not going to bring much comfort to them. So when will the minister be in a position to report on the results of the physician assistants pilot project so Nova Scotians know they are benefiting from this initiative?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I think this is an opportunity where the members on both sides of this legislature share our objective to meet the needs, the healthcare needs of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, recognizing the importance of supporting a wide variety of healthcare professionals to provide the care that Nova Scotians need. Mr. Speaker, specifically, the member wanted to know when Nova Scotians can see results. Mr. Speaker, they're already seeing results. The 811 Need a Family Physician registry, Mr. Speaker, peaked in November of last year with 59,000 people, Mr. Speaker, waiting for a physician. That number's down to 51,000 as of this month. That's a 13.5% reduction, Mr. Speaker, in the number of Nova Scotians waiting for access to primary care, Mr. Speaker. The steps that we've been taking, the investments we've been making in Nova Scotians, expanding collaborative practice, hiring nurse practitioners, physician recruitment, Mr. Speaker, has been working. More work to do, and we're committed to continuing that work.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
The problem is there's still too many Nova Scotians in this province remains without a doctor, including myself. Earlier this year, we heard that a clinic established to help transition refugees to stable primary care was experiencing a growing wait list. The Newcomer Health Clinic intended to link sponsored refugees to a family practice within 2 years, Mr. Speaker, but in 2018, only 46 of the clinic's approximately 1,800 patients were matched with a doctor. Unsurprisingly, a lack of family doctors was cited as one of the causes, but we're not really surprised, are we, Mr. Speaker? So I'll ask, can the minister indicate how many patients are currently registered with the Newcomer Health Clinic and how many of those patients were matched with a family doctor so far this year?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, the work that government and our partners and the health authorities continues as previous question in terms of partnering to expand access to healthcare professionals to support the physicians on the front line providing care, Mr. Speaker. It expands into areas, Mr. Speaker. We had committed to establishing about 70 collaborative health centres, Mr. Speaker, working with our partners at the Nova Scotia Health Authority. We have over 80 collaborative health practice centres underway in the province of Nova Scotia now, Mr. Speaker. Our recruitment initiatives, Mr. Speaker, expands into training programs, Mr. Speaker. We've added and committed to add 16 new seats at Dalhousie Medical School. 4 opened up in September. We added 25 additional residency training seats, Mr. Speaker. These initiatives, Mr. Speaker, are only occurring in Nova Scotia because we recognize that the future of health care and access to physicians, Mr. Speaker, requires more training. We're investing in those training opportunities. That's only one of the many things we're doing to support health care for Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, under a PC government, Nova Scotia was the first province in this country to institute patient navigators in hospitals, and I'll table that. That was nearly, though, Mr. Speaker, 20 years ago, and our demographics have definitely changed. Much as translation services are in more demand at our hospitals, there's also a need to help new Canadians navigate our healthcare system. It can be intimidating enough to settle in a new and unfamiliar home without the added stress of negotiating a new healthcare bureaucracy. And you know, Mr. Speaker, again, the promise wasn't kept in 2013 by this Premier. And navigators are available for new Canadians, but I'd like the minister to tell us here in the chamber today what hospitals are these navigators actually at?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot of information in the member's preamble and question. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, the Health Authority has established programs, as she's mentioned, for translation services, which of course are important, particularly for newcomers where English isn't their first language, Mr. Speaker. So they've partnered with an organization, all of our regional hospitals, Mr. Speaker, and a number of our community-based hospitals. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the language services, though, and this isn't just for for newcomers, Mr. Speaker. The Nova Scotia Health Authority also has patient representatives throughout the province. The contact information is available on the website, Mr. Speaker. I don't have it with me to table here today, but certainly we'll endeavour to share that information out to all of our caucus, all three caucuses, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that our assistants in our offices can help get Nova Scotians in contact with these patient representatives within the Nova Scotia Health Authority. I make use of them in my constituency office to help people in my riding, and I believe it's a valuable resource for all MLAs.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Mr. Speaker, when the Nova Scotia Health Authority amalgamated 9 district health authorities into one of the goals was to expedite the hiring process. The 2017 Accreditation Canada report, not our report, their report, on the Nova Scotia Health Authority suggested that this did not happen. Managers reported, and I'll table that a new hiring system, ironically called Success Factors, created a very lengthy process for hiring and made the staffing process challenging. A case in point, it took 20 months to hire one clinical nurse practitioner for Eastern Passage. My question to the Minister of Health is, did he or the Nova Scotia Health Authority meet with those managers who said that the Success Factors hiring process had made their work more difficult?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I believe the Success Factors module or program is the same program that's used by the Government of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, for recruitment programs. Mr. Speaker, that's a system for attaching prospective recruits with the recruitment team and allows the information to flow through. Mr. Speaker, I find it unfortunate that the member would use an example that I believe she would know very well. The time of fulfilling the position that she referenced really had nothing to do with that particular program, Mr. Speaker, but rather people applying for the position that was posted.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to respectfully disagree because the hiring process for that position came exactly through the Nova Scotia Health Authority, and I know for a fact that when several people who wanted to apply for that position applied to the Nova Scotia Health Authority through Human Resources, I had to bring it up in the House that Human Resources in the Nova Scotia Health Authority didn't even bother to respond to the people who had hired. So, in fact, it is the very same system I'm talking about that failed my community. Mr. Speaker, potential physicians complain that there are too many hoops to jump through to become a qualified physician to work in this province. Doctors, in fact, are only credentialed to work in one zone at a time, which is a deterrent, especially for those looking to do locums. The factors feed into the crisis in hiring physicians in long-term care facilities like Ocean View Manor. My question to the minister is it true that what I heard today that the Nova Scotia Health Authority and Department of Health and Wellness has still not been able to find physicians to take over in Ocean View Manor Continuing Care Centre in Eastern Passage?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to advise you and indeed all members of the legislature to the concern raised by the member opposite with respect to the licensing process. In fact, much effort has been made working with our partners with the College of Physicians and Surgeons, Mr. Speaker. Concerns that we've heard from frontline physicians about some of those regulatory licensing processes, Mr. Speaker. Working with them, Mr. Speaker, to establish new licensing processes for positions, Mr. Speaker, that Nova Scotia has not historically had. But we do rely on that college, Mr. Speaker, the independent regulatory body, to take a leadership role, but we have to bring our concerns to them. And I've been very pleased, Mr. Speaker, with their response to our efforts to work with them to expand licensing opportunities.
The honourable member for Sydney River, or pardon me, Argyle-Barrington.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said in this House before, cardiac arrest can happen to anyone at any time. In recent years, the province has taken steps towards increasing AED accessibility when Nova Scotians need them. For each minute that an AED is not used, the survival rate decreases by nearly 10%. These are life-saving devices, Mr. Speaker. They need to be readily accessible and quickly located when an individual is in cardiac arrest. My question is for the Minister of Health. Can you update the House on the number of AEDs currently registered in the province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member raising this particular topic. As the member rightly noted in his preamble, AEDs are life-saving devices. That's why I'm pleased, Mr. Speaker, that under our term, Mr. Speaker, we worked with our partners at with EMCI, EHS, Mr. Speaker, to establish a list, Mr. Speaker, to track AEDs within the province of Nova Scotia, helping to be able to communicate through our emergency health system to direct people, bystanders, to these services or these devices while waiting for an ambulance. I don't have the most current numbers, Mr. Speaker, but I'll endeavour to get them and report back for the House.
The honourable member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We can agree that it's important that AEDs are be made available and accessible here in the city as it is to have them in our rural communities. In an emergency, it doesn't matter if you're here in the city or in a rural area. Nova Scotians need the peace of mind that comes with knowing they can get these devices when they need them. So my question is to the Minister, what initiatives does the Minister believe would improve AED accessibility in all of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've seen really, again, living in rural Nova Scotia, but indeed being out and about here in the city as well. I think we've seen just ourselves, as I'm sure all the other members have, the growth of AEDs in public spaces. But Mr. Speaker, one of the missing pieces of links in ensuring that people responding to an emergency, first responders before our EHS paramedics arrive on scene, is knowing that there's an AED nearby to take the time to retrieve it. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we partnered with our EHS system to ensure that we have the list documented, Mr. Speaker, so we can help direct bystanders and first responders to these devices that may be in the vicinity of an emergency.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In April of 2017, the Premier visited a great community in Cumberland North of Pugwash and made a very important announcement of a new healthcare facility. In the summer, there was an article, and I'll table this document, by Jim Vibert that referenced the new announcement in Middleton of a new facility and the speed of which that new facility was going to be built. And I'm wondering if the Premier would be willing today just to reassure the people of Pugwash about the plans for that facility that was promised in April 2017.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would encourage you to read the article of Mr. Vibert. It's actually not accurate. Those are two very different buildings. The one in my riding actually is a collaborative care centre, which actually become a training model. He doesn't always look to the factual parts of those things, so I would encourage you to look at that. But I want to assure the honourable member that her community, that community is not forgotten. As a matter of fact, we had teams in there as recently as this month, working with clinicians to ensure that not only do we have the appropriate infrastructure, but what happens inside of that infrastructure reflects the reality of that community today.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the Premier for the response. The most recent update that I was able to get from the Minister, the Transportation TIR Department, is that the details and the plans have actually been completed and it is now in the Department of Health and Wellness. And the community is happy to see that it's part of the capital plan. So I'm wondering if the Minister of Health would be able to give us today a timeline so that the community of Pugwash and the northern area of Gulf Shore, northern area of Nova Scotia, can have a bit of an idea when we'll have shovels in the ground. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, I want to thank the gentleman for the question. There's continued ongoing conversation with the community to ensure that the beds, Mr. Speaker, that would be in that facility reflect what is required in the community. I believe that conversation has been ongoing. As well, as part of her riding, Mr. Speaker, the regional hospital is there looking at how do we deal with the issues around the emergency room in that particular facility. We're looking at that footprint as well to figure out how do we best respond to those needs as we are in Yarmouth when it comes to the regional facility there. So it is not a simple look in an isolation at one facility in one part of your constituency and not at the other. Both of those facilities will play a role in delivering primary care, and quite frankly, the regional hospital will play a role that has continued to play, we believe can have an enhanced role of continuing to provide emergency care in that community in the broader sense, Mr. Speaker, in that community, we look forward to working with them and making those investments.
The honourable member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, vehicle collisions are all too frequent along Highway 103 at exit 32 in Argyle. In 2016, the then Minister of TIR said the highway was on his radar screen and spoke about short-term and medium-term solutions, which I'll table. 3 years later, nothing has changed. In early 2019, the Minister was asked again about issues at exit 32. And said that they're looking closely at a significant connector down there. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that people in Argyle-Barrington have been looking closely at exit 32 for years, and they see nothing has changed. So my questions to the Minister, can he tell us if he's still looking closely at exit 32, and what does he see?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. I would be happy to invite the member to the department, and we can sit down and take a look at the current status there. And I would suggest that he work with his newly elected member in the area to make sure that we get good federal participation when we go to correct that situation.
The honourable member for Argyle-Barrington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So my predecessor asked this question many times. So the minister said in 2016 that it was on his radar and in consideration for not too distant future work. He said they're looking at short-term and medium-term solutions. So again, no obvious action has been taken. So solve the problem once for all. That's what I'm asking from the minister. When can we expect work to begin?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. In 2016, my radar was with the Department of Natural Resources, but I can go back and check the screen and see just where we were.
Please, time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call public bills for second reading?
We'll now call public bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call bill number 204, the Workers' Compensation Act?
We'll now call bill number 204, the Workers' Compensation Act. The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I move that bill number 204, entitled an act to amend Chapter 10 of the Acts of 1994 and 95, the Workers' Compensation Act, be read for the second time. I'd like to take some time today to share proposed changes to the Workers' Compensation Act. Changes that will ensure that all volunteer firefighters have access to workers' compensation insurance. Firefighters put their lives at risk every day to make sure we are all safe. Government is committed to ensuring that they are protected while they're on the job and while they're training. There are more than 6,000 volunteer firefighters in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, and half of them have no insurance. This is not acceptable. Mr. Speaker, these proposed amendments will ensure all firefighters in our provinces, no matter where they live, are adequately protected. Government has been in discussion with volunteer firefighters, the Fire Service Association of Nova Scotia, the Association of Municipal Administrators, the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities, as well as the President of the Union of National Defence Employees, Local 80412, that represents civilian firefighters at CFB Halifax throughout the development of these amendments. Their concerns have been heard, and it's time we take action. The amendments address many of their worries and will ensure greater protection. The proposed changes to the Act will require municipalities to provide WCB workplace injury insurance to all volunteer firefighters. I am pleased to say this will also include cancer and PTSD presumptions. Mr. Speaker, this means possibly 3,000 or more volunteers will have access to workers' compensation coverage should a workplace injury occur. Currently, some fire departments have private insurance, and although coverage varies across the department to department, some departments actually have none. These amendments will also change the definition of a firefighter to include federal firefighters. This will enable the Department of National Defence firefighters to access the cancer-related presumptions as well, which unfortunately is not the case at the present. Mr. Speaker, these amendments will also create authority to limit or expand presumption in certain cases through regulation. There are currently 6 types of cancers that are eligible for the firefighter's cancer presumption. And Mr. Speaker, for cancers that are added to the presumption in the future, it will be possible for firefighters to file a claim based on diagnosis up to 1 year before the cancer is added to the eligibility list. The list of cancer presumptions has not been updated since 2003, and going forward and throughout the fall and winter, we will consult with firefighters as they have requested, paid and volunteer, their employers and the WCB about expanding the list of cancers that will also be covered. Mr. Speaker, the proposed amendments are a step in the right direction. Firefighters risk a lot for us, and we're thankful for the challenging work they do for us every day. Whether paid or volunteer, they all deserve to be protected, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for his comments. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to all the firefighters throughout the province, both volunteer and paid. Myself personally, I have 13 fire departments in my own constituency, many of whom who work full-time themselves, have their own families, and basically put their lives at risk to perform this job. I'm looking forward to hearing the comments from firefighters during law amendments. Hopefully we can continue to expand on the list of presumed cancers, because we do lag behind a little bit as opposed to other provinces. So I think the consultation will be beneficial. Otherwise, not much else to say. I look forward to law amendments. We support this bill. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're happy to hear that the government has brought forward these changes to protect all firefighters in Nova Scotia, and that updates to the cancer presumption list will be forthcoming. We in the NDP know that it is crucial that this list be updated as soon as possible. Firefighters are there for all of us when we need them, when we tuck our kids into bed at night, knowing that if the unthinkable happens, there will be people that come to help us. And we thank all of the volunteers and the career firefighters in the province. Firefighters' work is giving them cancer at rates much higher than the general population. In comparison to all causes of fatality in the general population, cause of death in firefighters is 2 to 3 times more likely to be due to cancer, even though firefighters tend to lead healthier lifestyles as a requirement of their work. Back in 2003, Nova Scotia was a leader on the national stage when it first came to presumptive coverage. We introduced some of the first legislation to guarantee that firefighters wouldn't have to fight to prove that their illnesses had developed as a result of exposure to the carcinogens that they are part of their jobs. Since then, though, we've fallen behind. Every other province has updated their list of eligible cancers. We're at the back of the pack, only covering the 6 originally outlined. Over the course of the last 15 years, a number of major cohort studies have been undertaken and have compared cohorts of thousands of firefighters to the general population, have found that firefighting puts people at significant risk of developing ureter cancer, penile cancer, testicular, esophageal, breast, prostate, skin, digestive tract, multiple myeloma, pancreatic, ovarian, and cervical cancer. That's in addition to, Mr. Speaker, brain, bladder, kidney, colon, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and leukemia, which were covered in 2003. We need to ensure that these cancers are rightfully recognized as workplace illnesses so that the firefighters can get the support they need. We owe it to our firefighters to extend these benefits to them. Too many people have already died without presumptive coverage. They can't afford, Mr. Speaker, to wait any longer.
The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure as a firefighter, a past fire chief, trainer, lecturer, to stand and speak on this bill. In my previous to politics, I actually sat on the Fire Service Association in Nova Scotia as an executive member, and I would like to say kudos to the minister for taking the time and consulting with the association a few weeks ago. Albeit they do have a few other questions. I'm sure we're going to hear from law amendments, but I just wanted to add my 2 cents worth in this conversation and look forward to maybe some reply or maybe a meeting afterwards with the minister and get some clarity on a few things. First and foremost, fire doesn't know the boundaries of a career or volunteer. Fire doesn't know the boundaries of a rookie or a senior firefighter. Fire is approached the same dynamic way from a volunteer to a career. The training standards are equivalent nowadays. It's not like the days of a volunteer department gathering up as many men and women as they could and showing up with a bucket brigade. The training the volunteers put in is top-notch nowadays, equivalent to what goes on in a career department. I can speak about the relevance of what an insurance coverage looks like in a small rural department that isn't covered by workman's comp but does have a private insurance coverage. When I left as chief last year to follow my political adventures, my firefighters at the time had full coverage under a private insurance coverage. Full coverage, that is, from the time they left their house to do any duty, not just firefighting, not just training, but PR issues. I'm sure we've all gone out on Good Friday and saw our local fire departments out doing a muscular dystrophy drive to raise funds. They were covered at that aspect if they were injured. There's not just fire calls and training that require to maintain and keep an emergency services operating. There's equipment checks, there's meetings, there's public relations through what we just saw a few weeks ago, Fire Prevention Week at the schools. Are our firefighters, volunteer firefighters, still going to be covered if something were to happen during one of those PR adventures? Another few other questions that have come up. Traveling to and from training. As stated in the department's release, they would be covered from the time they arrived to the training site to the time the training was done. Under private insurance right now, they're covered from the time they leave their house to the time they return to their house, or business or recreation as it would go. Is that coverage still going to look the same? Or are these small rural departments going to have to take out a second insurance coverage to ensure that their firefighters are still covered and protected throughout those times? Another question where I didn't see full explanation, are our firefighters going to be covered under this act when they're actually doing the work for lands and forestry at forest fires? The question that's been bared by many municipalities over the weekend, who pays? And I do know that the minister has covered a little bit of this during a little bit of media coverage, but it's still not very clear to the departments, the association, or the municipalities what that whole concept's going to look like. And I can respect, from being at the administration level of a fire service, the minister of WCB really isn't going to cover that aspect of it. But these are questions that are being asked. And one of the last few other little questions that are being asked is who will administer this for those rural fire departments that may not have an administrative staff that actually looks care of it? Is it going to be the municipality that manages the files for the department, or is there going to be a department within your WCB department that would manage it just for the volunteer sector? There may be a few little loopholes there. I'm sure there's answers out there, and it's worthwhile for the conversation. The other thing that I'm really partial to, I spoke at last session about it, was the list of cancers, and I welcome the conversation that you brought up in your prelude. So I do look forward to seeing the fire service show up at law amendments and remarks back from the minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Fine to recognize the Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. It will be for second reading of Bill number 204, the Workers' Compensation Act. The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Great to have the conversation with my colleagues. I think we're all on the same page. We want to help our firefighters. To answer a few of the questions, because I do have the information, a lot of the nuances of the coverage will be put through regulations over the next year, because we have to give 1 year notice to our municipalities. In terms of what WCB has reported back to us, the mandatory coverage is for our volunteer firefighters, and they can also still keep their other insurance, and the cost WCB has come back with is $48 per year, which for the service they do, especially on a volunteer basis, it's really it's nothing. Like, you know, so in my meetings with the Federation of Municipalities, as we discussed it, they felt as I did that our volunteer firefighters are worth every penny of it, but we did recognize that there could be some smaller municipalities that might have difficulty covering the fees, because even $48, and if they have a handful of volunteer firefighters, their budgets are so small or so tight that they might have difficulty with it. So with that, what I committed to the Federation of Municipalities is we're more than happy to work with them, and we will do that. Our goal is to make sure that our firefighters are covered any way the province can do to assist. And I'll give an example. When we, a few years ago, provided the license plates free of charge, you know, the cost of that was more than the cost of this. So, you know, the cost of this on a global perspective for our volunteer firefighters is not that high, and they deserve every cent of it. And we'll make sure one way or the other they get the coverage. I was pleased that our municipalities are in favor of it. One thing I will add about the cancer coverage is for my colleagues, I was more than happy to bring in and, based on data across the country, cover all the cancers that are shown to have a higher prevalence in our firefighters. But it was actually the firefighters who said, we want to sit down and discuss these with you. So, you know, I respect that, and, you know, and I'm going to give them that opportunity. And we do want to, on royal assent, the cancer coverages we come out with in the very short future will be covered from that date going forward, so that anyone who, they don't have to wait the 1 year period. We have the backdating clause. But I also want to add that we were leaders in this once, and I fully anticipate that we will be at the top of the country in terms of cancer coverages when we start passing the regulations. And I think the original intent was great, and we all agreed with it. I'm sure back in 2003 it was passed unanimously. What I really like about this bill is, as data shows new cancers, as data shows that cancers have a higher rate in our first responders, in our firefighters, we can add them in regulation. And I think that gives a lot more flexibility. And in the past decade, it would have been done, and we wouldn't be lagging the rest of the country if the previous bill provided that flexibility. This bill has it, so not only will we catch up with the rest of the country in terms of coverages of cancers, as new data comes forward and shows that that with certain new cancers, there's a higher rate amongst our firefighters, we'll be able to get them that coverage in a speedy amount of time. With those few words, Mr. Speaker, I rise to close debate on Bill number 204. Thank you.
Motion is for second reading of Bill number 204, the Workers' Compensation Act. Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 204, an act to amend Chapter 10 of the Acts of 1994-95, the Workers' Compensation Act.
Ordered that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Is that okay for you? That's good. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call public bills for third reading?
We'll now call public bills for third reading.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 175, the Marine Renewable Energy Act?
We'll now call Bill number 175, the Marine Renewable Energy Act. The Honourable Minister of Mines and Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 175, the Marine Renewable Energy Act, be read a third time and do pass. Mr. Speaker, this bill is in support of our title industry. We have seen millions of dollars invested over the years to support the potential of the Bay of Fundy. Not only investment from a private sector level, but as well from our federal partners. This has great opportunity for us here in the province, and essentially, as I've said in my second reading remarks, what this allows us to do is to continue down that path to give the companies that are in the Bay of Fundy that line of sight past the expiration of their current agreements. So, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the comments from my colleagues on third reading. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I've spoken about this on second reading. I don't believe I have anything much further to add today. We're supportive of this, and we sincerely hope that that tidal power will become a force in the world, and that it will start here in this province. And my hope is that the investment that's being made really by ratepayers, in this case, people who are paying for their power, and also for taxpayers, because we know there is a lot of tax dollars invested, close to $30 million by the federal government invested in these companies that are doing this research work with the hope of commercializing this technology. Mr. Speaker, my hope is that the payoff on tidal energy comes back to Nova Scotians with, well, number one, as a help to the environment, but number two, in either lower power rates or perhaps some kind of a royalty that comes back to Nova Scotians. Because let's not forget, Mr. Speaker, this is a positive thing, but Nova Scotians are paying a premium for it, and for that investment, I believe they should get something back in return. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to stand and speak for a few minutes on this bill. There is no doubt that tidal energy is an exciting industry, Mr. Speaker, that has incredible potential to provide large amounts of energy to our power grid, as well as significant economic and employment opportunities. And I don't need to remind this House of the impending climate crisis and the pressing need to bring our greenhouse gas emissions targets to a level that's consistent with 1.5 degrees of warming, or the pressing need to invest in a green jobs plan. This province needs massive investment in wind and solar and tidal power, and while there is no doubt that we will need to make significant and rapid investments in renewable energy, we also need to do this in a way that does not have unintended consequences for the environment and does not present a cash grab of public money for private companies. We also need to make sure that we understand the impact of tidal energy projects on the marine environment, including the fishing industry. If these amendments permit projects that are significantly larger in scale, number, and potential impact on marine life and on the environment than the original intent of the environmental assessment that covers the Fundy Ocean Research Centre for Energy, then it will need an updated environmental assessment that takes into account the project's impacts. Not to mention thorough and adequate consultation with all stakeholders involved, including fishers, coastal communities, fisheries experts, and the Bay of Fundy Inshore Fishermen's Association, who I was alarmed to learn that they were not consulted on the original Marine Renewable Energy Act or these amendments. The fact of the need for a careful assessment of environmental impacts was underscored after a confirmed sighting of a North American right whale just recently in the offshore. And I don't need to remind this House of the Cape Sharp Generation Project that illustrates the risk and uncertainty associated with the marine renewable energy sector. While we need to make the sector viable for the people who are testing technology and doing research in it, we need to do so safely and in a way that protects the environment and does not leave the public on the hook for the bill. Though investment in the sector is certainly needed, funding tidal energy projects cannot be an open opportunity to raise Nova Scotia's power rates. It also cannot be a shell-out of public money for private companies like Emera. We have spoken a lot in this House of this government's concerning coziness with the private sector, prioritizing corporations over the regard for ordinary people in the province. Any amendments to the Marine Renewable Energy Act should be careful to use the Utility and Review Board as it is intended, and that is to provide effective oversight and ratepayer protection and to ensure fairness in the way that our utilities operate. And this was the spirit of the amendment that our caucus submitted during the Committee of the Whole House that asked to update Section 49B to have electricity procured at a price determined by the Utility and Review Board after consultation with the Minister rather than through the Minister alone. I also question another section of the bill that states that the Utility and Review Board shall, quote, allow a public utility to recover the costs in connection with any power purchase agreement the public is deemed to have entered into through the public utilities rates, end quote. If this presents an opportunity for ratepayers to be stuck with the cost of these projects, then it is highly objectionable. Again, I am forced to wonder whether these amendments represent an undermining of the original intent of the environmental assessment that governed the site, which was intended to be used for small-scale demonstration projects. I'm sorry. All the while giving the minister powers in the act that seemed to me that would fit better with the Utility and Review Board for reasons of transparency and accountability. I'd also like to remind the House that the Utility and Review Board has already approved rate increases for existing feed-in tariffs related to marine renewable energy. I would like to close by reiterating the urgent need to invest significantly in the development of renewable energy sectors, as well as significant investments in energy efficiency measures and public transit. This is the only path available to averting the worst of the climate crisis. This needs to be done carefully with keen attention to any unintended impacts on the environment and consciousness of the fact that people in Nova Scotia already have some of the highest electricity rates in the country. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Fine, recognize the Honourable Minister of Energy and Mines. It will be to close third reading of Bill number 175, the Marine Renewable Energy Act. The Honourable Minister of Mines and Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the comments from my colleagues. Just very quickly, just to some of the comments. Title has been something that every party has been involved with when they were in government. This has been a bit of a long game for us. So everyone can take some pride and some responsibility in what we've been trying to do to harness the tides in the Bay of Fundy. We are seeing significant investment down there. As the PC caucus member said, we've seen $30 million investment from the federal government. We're seeing millions of dollars of investment on the private sector side. We now have companies that are interested in actually doing their manufacturing production here. So these are things that I'm working on with the department on a daily basis. In regards to the comments from my colleague with the NDP, Title is part of the mix for us when it comes to what the potential is for clean energy. We are a national leader in reducing climate change. We are investing almost $120 million in efficiency programs and services for Nova Scotians in the next 4 years, and we're going to continue to do it. I'm very excited about what I'm seeing in the title industry, and what this legislation allows us to do, again, is to give those companies that line of sight past their current agreements to ensure that not only they can continue to operate down there in the Bay of Fundy to test their equipment, but also gives them that confidence when they go out to investors to look for money. So with those words, Mr. Speaker, I'll close debate on third reading of Bill 175. Thanks.
Motion is for third reading of Bill number 175, the Marine Renewable Energy Act. Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried.
Number 175, an act to amend Chapter 32 of the Acts of 2015, the Marine Renewable Energy Act.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 177, the Public Utilities Act?
We'll now call Bill number 177, the Public Utilities Act. The Honourable Minister of Energy and Mines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill 177, the Public Utilities Act, an act to amend, be read for a third time and do pass. Mr. Speaker, to provide some brief comments, I spoke a bit about this during second reading. Essentially, what we're doing here is cutting red tape for some of our largest utilities here in the province. This would include organizations with over $100 million in revenue. That's Nova Scotia Power, Maritime Link, and Halifax Water. So essentially, again, briefly, what this does is that currently the utilities need to seek approval from the Utility Review Board for spending above $250,000 when that spending is outside of their annual capital plan. This legislation raises that ceiling to $1 million, and essentially what that does is eliminates approximately 40 approvals that would go through the Utility Review Board, which in general these processes cost about $50,000 per application. Again, just to provide a few examples of what this would mean for Nova Scotia Power, it would remove some of these reviews, which includes their routine business, such as valve replacement on boilers, replacing a transformer at a hydro station, or replacing cooling water intake screens at power plants. So, Mr. Speaker, again, this is about reducing red tape for for some of our largest utilities, and again, the UARB still holds that ultimate oversight when it comes to making the decisions on these capital expenditures. So, with those, I look forward to the comments from my colleagues.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, once again, we'll be supporting this legislation. Spoke on this on second reading as well, and really not much to add here, Mr. Speaker. I think these changes, they're really common sense. If consumers do have a fear that projects are going to get approved, there is always the ability for the UARB to look back at them and to make sure that they provide a good value for ratepayers, whether it's Nova Scotia Power or whether it's other utilities in the province with that have projects under $1 million in capital construction. So we'll be supporting this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, I will also stand, and I'm happy to stand, to address Bill 177, the amendments to the Public Utilities Act. This is a change that both the Utility Review Board and the utilities have asked for, and as I have said previously, it makes sense to reduce unnecessary administrative burden on the Utility and Review Board and on the utilities. However, I believe we need to be careful that this does not diminish the oversight and accountability role that is played by the Utility and Review Board. It's my view that there are many changes needed to the way that Nova Scotia Power is regulated, and this includes a rethinking of the framework that allows Nova Scotia Power to make millions of dollars in profits each year. There needs to be stricter performance targets and related fines for the utility. It's easy to understand that if Nova Scotia Power faces a $1 million fine for exceeding targets around outages, for example, but upgrades to the grid in order to avoid extended outages cost $10 million, the company could easily decide to overshoot the target and pay the fines. So this is an example of the kind of dynamic presented by the private for-profit monopoly arrangement that we have with Nova Scotia Power. It's not hard to see that households and families are the natural losers in this situation. And as we know, we know that the Nova Scotia Power has just last week gone before the Utility and Review Board asking for a rate hike over the next 3 years that would see households' power bills increase by 4.5%. We've talked about this a lot in this House before, but energy poverty is a real problem in Nova Scotia. 13% of people in our part of Canada are considered to have unsustainable energy burdens. And this, Mr. Speaker, is clearly problematic and something that this government has failed to make any real progress in addressing. So I would urge them to take real measures in tackling the problem of energy affordability in Nova Scotia while they're looking at these types of changes to legislation. Thank you.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Energy and Mines will be to close third reading of Bill number 177, the Public Utilities Act. The Honourable Minister of Mines and Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'd like to thank the comments from my colleagues. Appreciate the support for this bill. It does cut some red tape for these companies. It reduces some of those approval hearings. But again, as I've said, the UARB continues to hold that ultimate responsibility over the approvals. On some of the comments from my colleague from the NDP, there are provisions in place that Nova Scotia Power has performance standards, and they can be held to account by the UARB if it is deemed that something has happened that's not in the best interest of ratepayers. And in regards to energy poverty, that's something that we all think about on a daily basis. That's why we've expanded our efficiency programs from just electrically heated homes to homes of all heating sources. That's why we're going to spend $11 million retrofitting public housing across the province. We're going to continue to invest in these programs. That's why first in Canada, we're going to retrofit 2,400 homes in Mi'kmaq communities across Nova Scotia. So Nova Scotia is going to continue to be a national leader in fighting climate change, but also continue to support our most vulnerable Nova Scotians as they live comfortably in their homes. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motion is for third reading of Bill number 177, the Public Utilities Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 177, an act to amend Chapter 380 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Utilities Act.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 169, the Expropriation Act.
Now call Bill number 169, the Expropriation Act. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before moving that Bill 169 be read a third time and do pass, I'd like to make a few remarks. Mr. Speaker, these changes provide clarity to the legislation while also supporting investments in the major infrastructure projects that Nova Scotians have told us are a priority, such as highways and healthcare facilities. While expropriation is always a measure of last resort, there are times when private land is impacted by infrastructure projects and claims for compensation come forward, even when land is not expropriated. I know expropriation can be a difficult process, and Nova Scotians experience it want clear and fair rules. Our goal, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure that everyone or anyone impacted by expropriation doesn't suffer a financial loss. Mr. Speaker, the current legislation needs clarity around what compensation a person is entitled to, and these changes provide that clarity. This is a very complex area of law, Mr. Speaker, and we need clear, simple language and rules so that everyone is on the same page. The end goal is to make landowners who experience expropriation financially whole. Right now, some are gaining more financially because the legislation is not clear, and interpretations are being made by all parties involved. Mr. Speaker, we have an obligation to ensure landowners who are impacted by expropriation are reasonably compensated through clear and fair rules. We also have an obligation to protect the interests of taxpayers, Mr. Speaker, and provide responsible fiscal management. Fair and reasonable compensation means that an impacted landowner will be compensated for what they are entitled to in terms of their actual financial loss. No more, Mr. Speaker, but no less. Mr. Speaker, these changes will clarify what can be claimed through legal processes under the Act. With this increased clarity, our hope is that these changes will reduce the need for litigation by landowners. Finally, these changes will bring us in line with jurisdictions across the country. Mr. Speaker, I did want to speak to one of the inaccuracies about these changes. It was inferred that these changes will prevent landowners from receiving compensation for plans they had on their land. This is not the case, Mr. Speaker. To be clear, the change we are making will require compensation to be quantified in financial terms and that they actually be incurred by the landowner. Claims based on hypothetical scenarios will no longer be permitted. That is the key word, Mr. Speaker, hypothetical. In the past, claims were paid for proposed and hypothetical future uses of land. We are clarifying that a claimant cannot seek compensation for a possible personal or business activity which they may have been considered into the future. Another change I want to take a moment to speak to, Mr. Speaker, is injurious affection claims where no land is taken. Going forward, these claims will be heard by the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia instead of the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board, who currently hear these claims. These disputes are like other types of cases that the Supreme Court hears regularly, and they are best positioned, Mr. Speaker, to hear the evidence and hear the cases. The Halifax Regional Municipality presented to law amendments earlier this week, Mr. Speaker. In their presentation, they likened expropriation claims to nuisance claims that are currently heard at the Supreme Court. HRM spoke of how a move to the Supreme Court will result in a more consistent treatment of such claims. Courts are used to assessing evidence in these types of cases. As HRM further addressed in their presentation, the time frames and processes involved in bringing these cases before the Supreme Court are comparable to that of the UARB, the Utility and Review Board. Mr. Speaker, it was mentioned in second reading that people would incur additional legal fees. That's not necessarily the case, Mr. Speaker. Many of those matters, most of those matters that go before the Utility and Review Board are presented by legal counsel on behalf of clients or property owners. Having these matters heard at the Supreme Court, Mr. Speaker, will also provide opportunity for settlement conferences and the ability for parties to get decisions on questions of law where there is a disagreement. It has been suggested, Mr. Speaker, there is a need for a provision to address the expropriation of a personal residence. And I want to clarify and advise all that provisions already exist within this legislation to address such circumstances. These have not changed, Mr. Speaker. Provisions also already exist to deal with the return of expropriated lands that are no longer needed for a project. Mr. Speaker, in such instances, the land would be returned or offered back to the property owner from which the land was expropriated. Mr. Speaker, others spoke of compensation for legal fees. The cost tariff for legal fees is the same and is applied to all other court actions before the Supreme Court and will now be proportional to the value of the expropriation. This, Mr. Speaker, mirrors the approach taken by British Columbia. Mr. Speaker, these amendments will help ensure we have clear parameters in place to guarantee that landowners impacted by expropriation receive fair and reasonable compensation that they are entitled to, while also balancing the interests of taxpayers and ensuring prudent fiscal management. Mr. Speaker, with those remarks, I close my thoughts and comments on this particular matter.
He didn't close it. No. The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am happy to rise and speak to Bill 169, the Expropriation Act. Mr. Speaker, as I said in second reading of this bill, let's remind ourselves what is at the heart of this act. This is about the government coming to take the land and property of private citizens. And as private citizens, we cannot stop them. All we can do is hope that we are fairly compensated. In 1997, the Supreme Court of Canada in the Dell Holdings decision described the legal status of expropriation power by stating, "The expropriation of property is one of the ultimate exercises of governmental authority. To take all or part of a person's property constitutes a severe loss and a very significant interference with the citizen's private property rights. It follows that the power of an expropriating authority should be strictly construed in favor of those whose rights have been affected." Mr. Speaker, government has very deep pockets. Actually, there are pockets. And this is why I have concerns about the amendments the government has brought forward, because it is the government getting to decide the standards of fairness in a process that they are party to. And these amendments, I believe, make it harder and more costly for private citizens to be treated fairly. The revisions to Sections 5 and 6 of the Expropriation Act remove the involvement of the Utility and Review Board from certain disputes like compensation. It makes it so that if a landowner wanted to dispute their compensation, the first place they would see is the doors of the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia to have their case heard. Mr. Speaker, the UARB is independent of government, and it has been proven as an effective, unbiased decision maker that is financially accessible to any citizen who feels aggrieved as a consequence of an expropriation by the Crown. It serves as an administrative tribunal, providing an affordable and efficient mechanism to mediate disputes which individuals are able to approach and attend very informally in an effort to find a reasonable solution. But now, Mr. Speaker, under these amendments, we are forcing Nova Scotians to the court system, which is very intimidating for most people. The process is very formal, and the rules of civil procedure are complicated and generally require the expertise of a lawyer to interpret, to figure out the simplest of details, like what to file and when. Mr. Speaker, I know if my grandmother would have found herself in a position like this, she would be frightened and forced to hire legal representation. And more than likely on her fixed income would not have been able to afford such representation. And Mr. Speaker, I'm sure she would not be alone if these amendments go forward. Mr. Speaker, it's about access to justice. We heard last week in this House that the court system is already congested. This amendment will simply continue to clog up the already maxed system, making it more expensive, challenging, and taking much longer to resolve, potentially years in some cases. I listened to Mr. Rob Penio, a lawyer who specializes in expropriation compensation cases and law amendments. He has extensive background, regularly representing landowners in compensation claims, and he's held in high regard for his expertise. Mr. Penio talked about the specialty and the acquired expertise of the UARB in hearing these special cases over the past 50 years in determining expropriation, and Mr. Speaker, I might add, one that is respected by the courts. And now the government is going to take that specialized ability away. The URAB have heard hundreds of expropriation cases, and now those will be heard by judges who, while exceptionally competent, do not have the same experience hearing these cases. If it isn't broken, why fix it, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Penio stated he felt that this was misguided and urged the government to leave it with the URAB. And we agree. Mr. Speaker, in 1997, the Supreme Court of Canada in the Dell Holdings decision also stated the Expropriations Act should be read in a broad and purposive manner in order to comply with the aim of the Act to fully compensate a landowner whose property has been taken. In a later decision in 2011, the Supreme Court of Canada stated that Parliament, like provincial legislatures, has expanded the traditional limited notion of legal costs to encompass appraisal and other costs. It is well established that an owner whose land has been taken involuntarily is entitled to reimbursement for the necessary expenses of pursuing his or her statutory rights to compensation. The only limitation being that these expenses must be reasonable and that these costs are part of the expropriation award. It would appear that the Supreme Court of Canada considered that expropriated or injured landowners are entitled to full compensation, including compensation for all of their losses, interest on awards, and costs. But with the combination of this Bill 169 and the implemented tariff of cost regulations made in an order in Council this year, it will injure that very object of full compensation to an expropriated landowner and produce an access to justice crisis in Nova Scotia. Owners of lands which will be expropriated after June 1st, 2019 will be denied the previously accessible access to compensation for their losses due to the removal of the compensatory entitlements and indemnification of legal and expert expenses necessary to put their claims forth for compensation. Mr. Speaker, there have been 17 expropriations of lands in Nova Scotia in 2019 and 17 in 2018. And I've heard since June 1st to present that there are 48 properties sitting in expropriation and will be affected by this bill. There has been no consultation with important stakeholders like the Canadian Bar Association, Federation of Small Business, Federation of Agriculture, and landowners. Mr. Speaker, we know expropriation of lands happen for the greater good. We also understand infrastructure investments such as hospitals and safe highways are a priority, such as the one the minister alluded to in Queens County, my constituency, during second reading. But, Mr. Speaker, we need to ensure the expropriation process provides fair, reasonable compensation and access to justice. Access to justice should always be paramount for Nova Scotians. Private citizens need to be treated fairly, and the amendments to this bill do not achieve that. Mr. Speaker, for those reasons, we will not be supporting this bill. Thank you. I'm sorry.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise and say a few words about Bill number 169, the Expropriation Act. As we've been discussing in this chamber regarding this bill, and as we heard at law amendments, expropriation is a very serious step. How matters of expropriation are dealt with can have a very significant impact on individuals and also on governments and expropriation authorities. The stated purpose of this act is to allow people whose land has been expropriated to receive reasonable compensation for their loss. Mr. Speaker, in my experience, the stated purpose of every act put forward lately is slightly different than the actual text of those acts. In this case, the notion of reasonableness, I would submit, needs to apply to both parties, the expropriating authority and the expropriated individual. Also needs to include an understanding of the role of differential access to justice can play in this process, including access to costs. One of the changes made through these amendments is to shift decision-making from the UARB to the Supreme Court, where the matter involves injurious affection. We heard two really different perspectives on that change in venue at law amendments. And Mr. Speaker, I confess that I have continued to hear very differing opinions on this from presenters at law amendments. But I haven't, Mr. Speaker, heard a really compelling case for why that change of venue needs to occur. So if that case exists, I'm confident that the minister will restate it, but at the moment we remain somewhat unconvinced. The board has developed respected expertise in expropriation compensation, including injurious affection, and the courts are not necessarily going to improve upon this in terms of their expertise. And at any event, Mr. Speaker, our courts are very busy, and we often hear complaints about inappropriate delay. And Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned previously when we were debating this bill, there is a long held tradition that anyone whose land is expropriated or harmed and is found to have a valid action around that expropriation doesn't go out of pocket, even if they contest the offered price. And thus, costs are awarded for all reasonable cases on a full recovery basis based on the court's assessment of what a reasonable costs are. So it's not an inflated fee by that may have somehow occurred. There are checks and balances on it, and yet for the broad majority of cases, Mr. Speaker, full costs are in fact recovered. And what we heard at law amendments that was troubling, particularly in terms of access to justice, Mr. Speaker, is that we've now seen a shift to the court cost system, where those costs, as opposed to being determined based on the reasonableness of the bill, are now determined based on tariffs in the civil procedure rules. And my understanding, Mr. Speaker, is that costs awarded under those tariffs are never full costs and are more often 30 to 50% of the actual cost. And Mr. Speaker, I submit that that would create a barrier to someone who wanted to challenge a decision going forward with that. As we know, Mr. Speaker, entering the court system is an expensive proposition, but if you meet with an expert or you meet with a lawyer and you're told that you have a very good case and that maybe in this case the expropriating authority has made a mistake in their assessment and you feel confident to go on, you can do that, Mr. Speaker, because you know that if, I mean, it's obviously still a gamble, but you know that if you are successful, that you will be not significantly out of pocket. That is no longer the case, Mr. Speaker, and that is worrisome, particularly, Mr. Speaker, as this change came in not with this Act, but as a result of the change in the regulations about which I can confidently say that no one in our caucus, but I don't think anyone was aware of before we heard the presentation at law amendments. Mr. Speaker, on the whole, while I confess that there still is some lack of clarity around the operation of this bill, we have heard enough concerns at law amendments and throughout the debate of this bill to have serious reservations around the provisions to which I just spoke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
If I recognize the Honourable Minister of Justice, who will be to close third reading of Bill number 169, the Expropriation Act. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and appreciate the comments of my colleagues, although we differ in principle on the intent and accuracy of the bill itself. With those comments, Mr. Speaker, I rise to close debate on the motion for third reading, Bill 169, an Act to amend Chapter 156 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Expropriation Act.
Motion is for third reading of Bill number 169, the Expropriation Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 169, an Act to amend Chapter 156 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Expropriation Act.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Minister of Energy and Mines on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're joined today in the East Gallery by a successful Cape Breton entrepreneur who's not only been successful in business but has done a tremendous amount of community work and leadership. I'd like to welcome George Unsworth to the gallery today.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 187, the House of Assembly Act?
We'll now call Bill number 187, the House of Assembly Act. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move third reading of Bill 187, an Act to amend Chapter 1, 1992 supplement of the Revised Statutes 1989, the House of Assembly Act. Mr. Speaker, these changes redraw the province's electoral map, including reinstating the ridings of Argyll, Clare, Richmond, and Preston, and C, the introduction of digital boundaries for electoral ridings. Mr. Speaker, these new boundaries are in response to a direct recommendation of the independent 2018-19 Electoral Boundaries Commission, a recommendation they developed after extensive consultation with Nova Scotians. Electoral Boundaries Commissions have an important job to do, and they are charged with doing it independently. They are tasked with balancing effective representation for all Nova Scotians with voter parity. Mr. Speaker, I thank the Commission for their extensive work and the many Nova Scotians who provided input through community consultation, written submissions, and most recently law amendments. With those few comments, Mr. Speaker, I close remarks.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to rise and speak briefly to third reading of Bill 187, an Act to amend Chapter 1, 1992, Supplement of the Revised Statutes 1989, the House of Assembly Act. Mr. Speaker, the Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission were charged with a very important and difficult job to balance effective representation and voter parity for Nova Scotians. We know this commission traveled across our province consulting with Nova Scotians. I was very happy to attend the meetings that were held in Shelburne and in Bridgewater, and I must say both were very well attended. We're also very happy to see the movement to digital boundaries. The access to these interactive digital maps will make it easier for Nova Scotians to view information about their ridings or others. Mr. Speaker, there was considerable representation at law amendments for this bill. I always find it encouraging to see the strong relationships people have with their government. It is the sign of strong democracy that people want their voices heard by their representative. Mr. Speaker, our caucus respects the extensive work completed by this independent commission, and we accept its report of April 2019 in its entirety. We are glad to see the government has brought forth this bill and respecting the work of this commission. Mr. Speaker, the Progressive Conservative Caucus will be supporting this bill. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise and say a few words to Bill number 187. We also accept this report and the work of the Independent Commission, depending on how you'd like to interpret my remarks, which are forthcoming. We wanted to just say a word, which we've done throughout this debate, about the Keefe report. The Keefe report was commissioned in advance of the constitution of this Electoral Boundary Commission to recommend changes that would help improve representation generally in Nova Scotia, both through electoral process politics and through other public processes as well. The amendment to this bill moved by our caucus in the Committee of the Whole House would have future commissions genuinely and earnestly investigate and consult Nova Scotians and experts, not just on where the boundaries lie specifically, but on the matter of proportional representation, among other things. And we believe that this is an important step to realizing better and fairer representation for everyone. It would also go a long way in ensuring that historically marginalized voices in our province are heard and represented politically. We also submitted an amendment, Mr. Speaker, that would have the government report on its progress towards implementing the findings of the Commission that resulted in the Keefe report. This would ensure, Mr. Speaker, that we are fully taking advantage of the opportunities presented by that Commission report to improve electoral representation, and that we don't have yet another good report that went out and did excellent consultation that sits on a shelf. The Keefe report recommended a number of ways, for example, that African Nova Scotian and Acadian communities could be supported to reach fuller levels of participation and representation in Nova Scotia. And it's key that the government follow up on these recommendations. These include things like adequate funding and support for African Nova Scotian and Acadian bodies, and enabling minority applicants to serve on agencies, boards, and commissions, among other recommendations. All of these recommendations, when taken together, present an important opportunity not only to improve representation for marginalized communities in Nova Scotia, but to enable fuller participation and more equitable access to society. This in turn presents an opportunity to make substantial progress towards justice in this province. And if not in this bill, Mr. Speaker, I urge the government to implement them in a serious and fulsome manner. And with those few comments, I will take my seat.
If I am to recognize the Honourable Minister of Justice, it will be to close third reading of Bill number 187, the House of Assembly Act. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleagues for their comments. With these circumstances, Mr. Speaker, I rise to close debate on the motion for third reading, Bill 187, an act to amend Chapter 1, 1992, supplement of the revised statutes 1989, the House of Assembly Act.
Motion is for third reading of Bill number 187, the House of Assembly Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 187, an act to amend Chapter 1, 1992, supplement of the revised statutes 1989, the House of Assembly Act.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That concludes government business for today. I move that the House now do rise to meet again tomorrow, Wednesday, October 23rd, between the hours of 1 p.m. and 5 p.m. As Wednesday is Opposition Day, I will now turn it over to the PC House Leader to provide tomorrow's agenda.
Just for clarity, you meant 5:30 p.m., correct?
1 p.m. and 5:30 p.m.
Perfect. Thank you. The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After the daily routine and question period, we'll be calling bills for second reading. Bill number 172, the Public Prosecutions Act, an act to amend respecting a human trafficking prosecution team. Bill number 173, the Education Act and the Education CSAP Act, an act to amend that act. And then Bill number 174, an act to amend the Victims' Rights and Services Act. We'll also be calling potentially Bill number 210, which was introduced today, which is an act to amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 2004, the Health Protection Act. So, Mr. Speaker, those four bills, we'll be calling three, but we just haven't decided yet, so we're calling the four for debate tomorrow.
Motion is for the House to adjourn to rise again tomorrow, Wednesday, October 23rd, between the hours of 1 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The House now stands adjourned until tomorrow at 1 p.m.